Chapter 294. The entire continent knew that as the last disciple of the Mountly Sword Sect Master, Qi Jin's cultivation was extremely high despite his young age. His even thinner and weaker body also possessed an extremely powerful strength. However, on this journey, he could clearly see that in terms of willpower and true battle prowess, he was far from being able to match up to this wolf youth. In the younger generation of cultivators, the wolf tribe youth Zhixio was very famous. He was no weaker than the Divine State's 7 laws, and sometimes even overshadowed the light of the Divine State's 7 laws. He was compared to Suyu Rong by a proud person like Tang 36 and viewed as someone that he truly had to surpass, because he lived on the snowy plains and faced the demons for many years. In those years, Zhixio was very young, unable to break into ethereal opening, nor did he have the protection of a sect or master. However, he had been constantly hunting demons under the cover of the wind and snow. Just this fact alone was enough to show how extraordinary he was. In the Mountly Sword Sect, Qi Jin and his senior brothers would occasionally discuss this matter, but no matter how they thought about it, they could not understand how he had managed to survive. Before Zhixio appeared in the capital to participate in the grand examination, people's impression of this wolf tribe youth was that he was cold and bloodthirsty. They believed that this was the most important reason why he could survive until now. Only after coming to the Garden of Zhou and escaping together with him did Qi Jin finally understand why he could survive on the snowy plains. It was because Zhixio really was like a wolf that survived. There were countless powerful demonic beasts in this world, and there were also mystical high-level creatures like the Dragon Clan. The wolves that lived in the wilderness, in comparison, were not special in terms of strength or bloodline. However, wolves were the most patient, the most persistent, the most cautious, and the most sensitive to danger in this world. The demonic wolf clan had the bloodline of wolves, so naturally, they also had such characteristics. Zhixio was a mixed blood between a human and a wolf tribe. When he was young, he was exiled from his tribe. Sadly, he lost the terrifying possibility of group battles, but this forced him to push the wolf tribe's ability to fight alone to an unimaginable level. His sensitivity to danger even surpassed the orthodoxy's priest calculations of the unknown with their fated star plates. Seeing Zhixio's face, Qi Jin's heart grew heavier and sadder. He thought to himself, if not for the fact that he had to save me, no matter how powerful that demon general couple was, Zhixio would have had a chance to escape. He would not have ended up in this situation, where the poison of the peacock plume had blinded him and forced him into this grassland of death. I'm sorry. He withdrew his gaze and looked at the front of his robe that was embroidered by his mistress. He said in a low voice, "It's all my fault for dragging you down." Zhixio was meditating with his eyes closed, as if he had fallen asleep, as if he had not heard what Chen Changsheng had said. This made Qi Jin feel even more sad, but also somewhat comforted, because he knew that Zhixio had definitely heard it. However, just when he thought that Zhixio would continue to remain silent, he suddenly heard a voice say, "Since you understand this point, remember to add more money after you leave." Zhixio really seemed to be sleeping, as if he was not the one who had said those words. Only the corners of his lips were slightly raised, as if he was smiling. In the dangerous snowfield, expressionless was the best cover in battle, so he rarely smiled. Very few people had ever seen him smile. Right now, there was no battle, and he could not see, so even he himself did not expect that he would smile. Seeing his smile, Qi Jin stared blankly. He forcefully nodded his head, grunted, and then also began to happily smile. However, he could not maintain his smile because they were still in the plains. His mood very quickly sank as the sun rose higher and higher over the plains. The Garden of Zhou already had several hundred years of history. At least tensome batches, or tens of millions of ethereal opening human cultivators, had come here, under the enticement of the legacy of the continent's #1 expert. Under the urging of the legend of the Sword Pool, countless cultivators had ventured into the plains. However, no one had ever returned alive. Whether in terms of cultivation or willpower, Those cultivators of the previous generation were not necessarily weaker than him and Zhixio. After entering the plains, they had only encountered a few packs of monsters. It was very obvious that the true dangers of the plains had not yet appeared, but they had already sensed many strange places. In this plains of the unsetting sun, the sun really did not sink below the horizon. According to the calculations of the flowing water bottle, after nightfall, the sun would turn into a halo of light that slowly circled around the plains. Moreover, the space in the plains seemed to be distorted. There seemed to be some sort of pattern to it, but it was impossible to grasp through observation. Coupled with the fact that as far as the eye could see, there was only green grass, so there was simply no direction. Without direction, there was naturally no way out. The people who entered the plains seemed to be walking forever, encountering more and more powerful monsters, until one day they finally died of exhaustion. Moreover, he was currently so heavily injured that he could not move, and Zhixio could not see, so how much longer could they last? Qi Jian lowered his head and looked at the bloodstain on his abdomen. His mood grew more and more depressed, and he sadly said, "I don't understand why." Zhixio knew that what he did not understand was not the plains, but the hearts of people. The inner sect disciples of the Mountly Sword sect had always been extremely close to each other. Under the leadership of Qiushan Jun and Go Hanshi, they were like family. As the youngest junior brother of the Divine State's 7 laws, Qi Jian had always been extremely doted on. In the depths of his heart, he had always treated his senior brothers as his own brothers. But who could have imagined that his third senior brother, Liang Xiaoxiao, who normally took care of him the most in Mount Li, would actually stab him by the lake, and stab him so viciously. Liang Xiaoxiao's stab had directly pierced through his abdomen, jolting and severing several of his meridians, and even more so had pierced through his heart. From yesterday until now, even when his mind was in a trance because of his heavy injuries, he had always been thinking about this question. He wanted to ask his third senior brother, just why had he done all of this? In the grass hut in the mausoleum of books, Zhixio had personally seen the feelings between the disciples of the Mountly Sword sect, as well as how they had cared for and cherished Qi Jian. Therefore, he could understand Qi Jian's current mood, and could clearly feel his disappointment, frustration, and sorrow. However, he did not know how to comfort him. After a moment of silence, he said, "I don't know why he wants to kill you, and I also don't really understand the relationship between you fellow disciples. This is because from the beginning of my memory, I have always lived alone. I don't believe that everything in the world needs a reason. I value results more, so you only need to remember that if he wants to kill you, then he is your enemy and no longer your senior brother." Zhixio was famous, and his story had spread far and wide across the continent. Many people knew that he was a mixed blood between a human and a wolf demon. When he was very young, he had been expelled from his tribe, and he had grown up alone in the wind and snow with great difficulty. Qi Jian raised his head to look at him, and suddenly felt that his figure was rather lonely and looked very pitiful. He immediately forgot his own sorrow and felt a great deal of sympathy and pity. He subconsciously reached out and grabbed his sleeve. Qi Jian didn't know why he would do this, and said, "It's different now." Zhixio slightly tilted his head, closed his eyes, and asked, "What's different?" Qi Jian wanted to say that he was sitting next to him, and that he was no longer alone, but he was a little shy and so nervous that he couldn't say it. Instead, he said, "Because you entered the Orthodox Academy?" Zhixio thought to himself, that Black Bear really did invite me to enter the Orthodox Academy, but I didn't agree. The reason why he had traveled from the snowy plains to the capital and participated in the grand examination was because he knew that Chun Changsheng had helped Her Highness resolve the problem of using the demi-human bloodline to cultivate in the human cultivation method. That problem was somewhat similar to the one he faced. As he grew older and his cultivation increased, his bloodline would become stronger, and the number of times he would experience the tide rush of blood would also increase. Perhaps at any time, he would die, and he needed Chun Changsheng to treat his illness and prolong his life. If Chun Changsheng could cure his illness, he would naturally leave the capital and return to the snowy plains. But that was a matter for the future, and now, in front of Qi Jian, he didn't say it. Now that he was trapped in the plains of the unsetting sun, there was a high possibility that he would have no future. So why make this heavily injured little fellow even more distressed? He said, "Orthodox Academy, not bad, but that rich kid's surname Tang is a bit annoying, so I still haven't made a decision." Yes, I also feel that Tang Tang is very annoying, but Qin Chang Sheng isn't bad. Speaking of which, in the palace guest room, we would sometimes discuss, if not for that engagement, perhaps our Mountly Sword sect could also peacefully coexist with your Orthodox Academy. We could become friends with Chun Chang Sheng. You could also become friends with me. Qi Jian looked at his face and softly said this, his voice getting lower and lower. The sun above the plains rose higher and higher, and the air gradually became hotter. The puddle of water emitted even more steam, making it feel rather stuffy. His hands began to sweat, perhaps due to nervousness or some other reason. Then, the medicine's effects began to take effect, and he felt rather drowsy, about to fall asleep. His mind was somewhat absent-minded, and his vision was also somewhat blurry. Suddenly, he saw Zheshio approach and grab his hand, preparing to do something. He subconsciously became nervous and uneasy, and even felt a faint fear. However, for some reason, he did not have any thoughts of resisting or rejecting Zheshio. Zheshio was prepared to take advantage of the time when the medicine was taking effect to treat his wounds and apply medicine. Because his eyes could not see, he could only use his hands to feel. Two steady hands moved up the back of Qi Jian's hand to his shoulders. Then, separated by a distance of about an inch, without touching his body, they moved down to his lower abdomen. Then they moved down, and his fingers rested on his belt. The clothing of the Mountly Sword sect was very simple, even plain. There were no complicated patterns on the belt, but the buckles were very sturdy. Under Zheshio's steady fingers, even the sturdiest buckles could not resist for a moment. Very quickly, the buckles on the belt were undone and his clothes were lifted up. Qi Jian was extremely nervous, but his mind was somewhat absent-minded. The drowsiness brought about by the medicine made him want to scream, but he did not have the strength to do so. His body began to tremble uncontrollably. Zheshio undid his clothes, revealing his pure white skin under the azure sky of the Garden of Zhou. He could not see it, but he could feel it. Qi Jian's body slightly trembled because of embarrassment, nervousness, and anger. His hands also began to tremble because the unexpected touch had revealed the truth of the matter. Qi Jian was extremely embarrassed. He tightly closed his eyes, his eyelashes incessantly blinking. He wanted nothing more than to faint just like that. Then, he fainted just like that. A reader called So-and-so 10 said that he was in a bad mood on the 12th of December. He asked me if he could willfully add a few chapters. I saw it too late, and I've never been a willful person. I don't know how he's feeling right now, so I'll add a small chapter. Of course, it can't really be considered an addition, because it's just a basic chapter. In short, I hope he's in a good mood, because this plot really does make my mood better. I love writing about men dressed as women, undressing, and men and women alone, so I directly threw these two couples into the plains. Of course, because Chun Su is the main character, the point of view will definitely be focused on them, but Qi Jian's part cannot be missed. That's it. I hope everyone is in a good mood, but why is my mood suddenly so heavy? That's right, I've added 2 chapters today, so what should I do tomorrow? The matter still hasn't been dealt with. Chapter 295. After an unknown period of time, she woke up. When she woke up, she realized that her clothes had been put back on, her belt fastened, and her clothes were neatly arranged. There wasn't even a blade of grass, not even the slightest trace of a night of escape. Under her clothes, she could clearly feel the existence of bandages. She didn't know how her wounds had been treated, but the pain had been greatly alleviated, and she seemed to be able to move a little. She opened her eyes wide and looked at her bosom. She felt the range of the bandages and imagined the scene in the grass, and her expression was somewhat at a loss. After a while, she turned her eyes with some difficulty, searching for Zheshio's figure. Zheshio was squatting at the edge of the grass, the furthest place from her in the grassland. The hem of his clothes had been torn off, exposing his 2 legs. His posture was rather unsightly, just like a dog. The torn hem of his clothes had probably become the bandages on her chest. She once more looked at her bosom, and for some reason, she felt extremely wronged. She thought to herself, how could you take off someone's clothes without asking for their permission? It was rather miraculous, but now that she no longer needed to hide her gender, she began to think like a little girl. For instance, she called herself I, not I, but for the moment, she had not become I. The more she thought about it, the more wronged she felt, especially when Jisho never turned around. This made her even more grieved. Wah! She began to cry. Hearing the weeping, Jisho, who was squatting at the edge of the grass, slightly trembled. After a while, he realized that the weeping had no intention of stopping, so he followed the sound and sat down in front of her. He did his best to say in a gentle tone, "Don't cry." Chi Jian's weeping temporarily stopped, her small face covered in tears. Jisho paused, then continued, "Otherwise, if we attract those monsters, it'll be troublesome." This was still finding something to say. Whether they were adults or teenagers, in short, men never understood that finding something to say at a time like this was the same as finding trouble, the same as seeking death. Chi Jian stared blankly, then began to cry again. She remembered that she had not made a sound, so she looked even more pitiful. Jisho was quiet for a while, then explained, "You know, right now I can't see anything, so..." Before he could finish, Chi Jian cried even more bitterly. She thought to herself, "Although you can't see, you've already touched my entire body. Do you still not want to admit it? Don't tell me you want to be irresponsible." Jisho felt a headache coming on. He had lived for 10-odd years, had fought for 10-odd years, had encountered countless terrifying monsters and demons on the snowy plains, had seen countless deaths. Yet, he had never encountered such a situation. He thought to himself, what should I do? If he continued to cry like this, what would he do if he affected his wound? Hearing Chi Jian sobbing, he felt very uneasy and also somewhat confused. He thought to himself, as the last disciple of the Mountly sect master, your cultivation is so high, you're already at the middle level of ethereal opening at such a young age, and your sword style is so strong that even Guan Feibai might not be your opponent. You're so good at comprehension, and in the mausoleum of books, you're able to see the third monolith. No matter how you look at it, you're amazing. So why do you just like to cry? Not knowing how to solve the problem, he could only sit on the side in silence. However, he did not know that this kind of response coincided with the truth of the relationship between men and women. Girls' emotional problems could only be solved by time. Most of the time, they just felt sad and wanted to cry. Then, you just had to let them cry and accompany them. When it was time to hand over a handkerchief, you just had to hand it over. When it was time to offer your shoulder, you didn't have to be polite. You didn't have to constantly comfort them. When they still hadn't truly calmed down and didn't want to cause trouble, anything you did was just meddlesome. As expected, the sobbing gradually subsided. Like a frightened little bird, Chi Jian lowered her head and said shyly, "Huh? Did you already know?" There were 2 meanings hidden in this question, both of which were extremely difficult to answer. If he had known beforehand, then the many physical interactions that had occurred afterwards, especially the scene just now, could have been explained in an even more negative way. Fortunately, Jisho was really not a talkative person, so he remained silent. Silence could have many meanings. Chi Jian could choose the explanation that made her feel the most comfortable. In reality, Jisho really had not expected this. In the course of their escape, there were a few times, especially when he was carrying her across the mountains and listening to her soft grunts, that he vaguely had some thoughts. However, those thoughts were fleeting, and he simply did not continue to think about them. This was because he could never have imagined that the last disciple of the Mountly sect master, the most beloved junior of the Divine State's 7 laws, the young genius who was already high up on the proclamation of Azure Sky at the age of 12, was actually a girl. Now that he thought back to those scenes in the grass hut in the mausoleum of books, he naturally had a completely different interpretation. At that time, the 7 of them lived under the same roof. Jishio, Chun Changsheng, and Tang 36 occupied the inner room, while the 4 disciples of the Mount Lee Sword sect lived in the outer room. Every day, when they slept, Go Hanshi, Guan Fei Bai, and Liang Banhu all squeezed together, leaving a large space for Qi Jian. Most importantly, Qi Jian had her own bed. At that time, Zhixiu and Qin Changsheng had thought that Go Hanshi and the others spoiled Qi Jian too much, or that the last disciple of the Mount Lee sect master had some special status. Only now did he understand that it was only because of the difference between men and women. What should they do next? Zhixiu was silent, and Qi Jian also did not know what to say. An awkward atmosphere lingered between the young man and the young girl. Just at this moment, a faint tremor came from the depths of the plain, closely followed by a low, thunderous roar. Zhixiu's expression changed, and he cocked his ear to listen for a while. After confirming that it was an extremely terrifying and powerful monster, he could no longer care about anything else. He took out a powder used to remove the smell and scattered it around grass. At the same time, he turned around and squatted down in front of Qi Jian, just like he had done for the past day and night. In the past day and night, they had already repeated this process many times. Logically speaking, they should have been very familiar with it. But perhaps because he had confirmed that Qi Jian was a girl, Zhixiu's movements seemed rather stiff, and the 2 hands that he had extended behind him were rather stiff. He looked like a duck about to be stewed. Seeing his appearance, Qi Jian's tears broke into laughter. She lightly patted his back, indicating that he should squat a little lower, and then she slowly leaned over, her 2 hands very naturally wrapping around his neck. Perhaps it really was a psychological factor, but Zhixiu felt that the feeling coming from his back had become much softer. In the plains 10-some li away, the ground beneath the grass was constantly bulging, emitting a terrifying roar similar to the roar of thunder. Some unknown creature was currently advancing at high speed. At the moment, the sun was blazing fiercely, piercing through the puddles of water beneath the grass and illuminating the figures of countless monsters. It was like a tide that was currently pursuing them. It was an extremely shocking sight. At the very front of the monster tide, Zhixiu and Qi Jian faced the rising and brightening sun as they waded through the water. She was still his eye, and he was still her leg. Which direction should we go? There seems to be a large meadow to the southwest. The terrain is a little higher, so maybe we should go take a look? That sound is coming from the east, so you might need to hurry up a little. The conversation ended, and it was quiet for a very long time. There was only the sound of the water being trampled on, the water splashing everywhere, and the grass gradually growing taller. After some time had passed, Qi Jian softly asked, "Are you very surprised?" Zhixiu was quiet for a while, then replied yes. She wrapped her arms around his neck, leaned against his shoulder, and smelled the familiar scent. She continued to softly ask, "What are your thoughts?" Zhixiu did not reply, because he did not know how to reply. Thoughts? What thoughts? The thought of my fingertips sliding across your slightly trembling body? No, at the time, the wolf youth's mind was a blank without any thoughts. She thought to herself, does silence represent unhappiness? After a while, her voice became even softer, and she nervously asked, "Then do you think I'm better as a man or as a woman?" This question did not strike at the heart, but went straight to the crux of the matter. Zhixiu thought about it. Starting from yesterday, you've been grunting and ahhing, tightly hugging me the entire way. If you were a man, this scene truly would not be pretty. So he said, "Women are better." Qi Jian blushed a little and said in a voice as soft as a mosquito, "Women being together has always been good. That's what you mean, right?" Zhixiu thought to himself, there's only one thing that's not good. You're no longer as magnanimous as before. So why is that? There was a folk tale on this continent, a story about a demon boar carrying his wife on his back. Yes, in both stories and reality, the vast majority of the time, it was the man carrying the woman. It was very difficult to imagine the reverse. So in this vast and boundless plain, Zhixiu was carrying the girl Qi Jian, and on the other end of the plain, Qin Changsheng was also carrying a girl. They had trudged through the plain for a very long time, but they were still in the wetlands, and walking was extremely difficult. The scorching sun shone on the reeds and unknown weeds in the water, as if it wanted to turn all the plants into gold and silver sculptures. Yet he did not sweat a single drop. His body constantly emitted a cold chi, dispelling the scorching heat and resisting the sun. Su Yurong closed her eyes and leaned against his shoulder, her eyelashes unblinking. From time to time, she would purse her lips. It seemed that with Chun Changsheng as a natural ice pod, she was sleeping very soundly. Even now, there was still no sign of Nang's pursuit. Chun Changsheng thought to himself that the demons were probably not willing to take the risk of entering this plane and had probably given up. Only then did he relax. His mind relaxed, and his injuries and exhaustion immediately surged forth like a tide. Like mud, they trapped his 2 feet, making it impossible for him to take another step forward. Around them were the wetlands and weeds, and there was no place to sit and rest. Chun Changsheng looked at the weeds that were even taller than a person, and had no choice but to carry Su Yurong and continue walking. But this time, he was not walking forward, but constantly circling around, trampling down all the reeds and weeds around him. Gradually, a flat ground formed from crushed green branches appeared in front of them. Relying on the cover of the reeds and weeds, it was very difficult for people outside to see what was inside. But if someone could look down from the sky, they would see a small circle formed from grass, several zhang in circumference. Su Yurong hugged her knees, lying on her side on a pile of grass. She looked very weak and pitiful, just like a newborn child. Chun Changsheng sat next to her, lowering his head to look at her face for a very long time. His expression was very serious, as if he had discovered something. I wish everyone a pleasant weekend. In these 2 days, I've organized a few songs related to the heavens chosen. Later, I will post them on my official WeChat account. Everyone can listen to them. Chapter 296. Waking up in the cave in the morning, the first thing he saw was a bloody and terrifying scene, followed by escape, and escape again. Although they had a few short conversations, in reality, this was the first time Chun Changsheng had the time to seriously look at the appearance of the white-clothed girl. He didn't know if it was because of the poison or some other reason, but the white-clothed girl's cheeks were abnormally swollen. Although it couldn't hide the elegance of her eyes, even without the swelling, she was still elegance. For normal girls, elegance was an extremely good description, but the elves were the descendants of the ancient elves and the Treants. They were always known for their beauty. Otherwise, they wouldn't have become the most greedy target of humans and demon nobles. Since the girl was an elf, the word elegance could only mean that she was very ordinary. Like a baby, she hugged her knees and lay on her side on the grass. Her eyes were tightly closed, and her long eyelashes didn't even blink, as if she was in a deep sleep. But Chun Changsheng remembered her eyes. Those eyes left a very deep impression on him in the cave. His eyes were very clean and were praised by Luo Luo and Tang 36 to be able to reflect people's eyes. Her eyes were also very clean, but they were different from his. Her eyes were like autumn water, but they weren't lake water. Instead, they were the color of a lighter and clearer water. The blue and white porcelain bowl was quietly placed under the eaves. A fresh spring rain fell on the earth and dripped down along the eaves. Drip, 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 drip. The spring rain gradually stopped, and the sunshine returned. The bowl under the eaves was the same as before, but there was more water in the bowl. It had no color, but it seemed to carry the feeling of spring. It had no taste, but it seemed to have been brewed with new tea. Yes, it was the layer of water in the porcelain bowl. It was clear and shallow, but not thin. Looking at the sleeping girl, Chun Changsheng really wanted her to open her eyes and let him see the color of water after the rain. Soon after, he remembered that when they first met in the cave, he had seen a strange dark green flame around her pupils. If he was not wrong, that should be the poison that Nank had planted in her. The poison of the peacock tail plume was extremely difficult to remove. It was no wonder that the elves, who were extremely close to nature and skilled in dispelling poisons from medicinal herbs, were so weak from this poison. Chun Changsheng placed his hand on her pulse and discovered that her meridians were actually empty. There was almost no chi left. What was even more frightening was that she had obviously lost too much chi and blood. Her pulse was already weak and weak. If this continued, she might actually die silently in her sleep. This discovery made him nervous, and he quickly tried to think of a solution. However, the medicine and food he had brought with him had already been thrown out by him during the battle yesterday. He thought for a while, and then sent his divine sense into the sword hilt. After a long silence, he finally found a box in a seemingly empty place. It was a last box. It was very heavy. As soon as it appeared on the grass, it caused the ground to sink a little. Opening the box, countless dazzling golden leaves and half a box of crystals appeared in front of him. At the very top was a thin book. It was the fundamental method of the Mount Lee sword style. This was the most direct and heaviest gift Luoluo had given him as a disciple. If the golden leaves and crystals in the box were used to buy a house, he could easily buy the entire 100 Flowers Lane. If he was willing to destroy the fundamental method of the Mount Lee sword style, even Qiu Shanjun would come to thank him. But in this dangerous plane, the golden leaves and the fundamental method of the Mount Lee sword style were useless. He pushed all the golden leaves to one side and put back the fundamental method of the Mount Lee sword style. He took out all the crystals in the box and piled them up beside her. Then he walked to the edge of the grass and stared at the shallow pool of water in a daze. He didn't know what he was thinking or what he wanted to do. After a while, he thrust his right hand into the water. But now his breathing and heartbeat had become extremely slow, so his movements were naturally even slower. The movements of his hand did not match his plan at all. There was a slight splash, but it was empty air. Just when he was feeling somewhat helpless, he suddenly realized that the water around his arm was covered in a thin layer of frost. In the next moment, he pulled his hand out of the water. His fingers tightly gripped a plump water snake. This water snake did not struggle at all. It was clearly frozen stiff. He didn't even have the ability to catch a water snake, but the extremely cold chi exuded from his body could help him do a few things. He once again slowly moved to her side. He took out his dagger and chopped off the head of the water snake. Then he brought it to her lips and began to pour blood into it. She was currently unconscious, so she naturally did not know how to swallow. It was unavoidable that some of the snake's blood seeped out from the corner of her lips, creating a rather bloody scene. After a while, the water snake's blood was completely drained. He placed the snake's body to the side and looked at the girl's face. He took out a handkerchief from his sleeve and began to carefully wipe her face. Even at a time like this, he was still living his normal life. The water snake's blood contained a spicy fire. It was the most suitable for replenishing blood. In addition, he extravagantly piled up the crystals around her. At the very least, he could ensure that she would not die in her sleep. Chen Changsheng finally let out a sigh of relief. He sat next to her and looked at the impenetrable grass around him. He began to truly stare blankly. He lacked medicine and could not directly replenish blood. It was very difficult to cure her. Moreover, his own situation was also very bad. The black dragon was sleeping in the lake outside of his ethereal palace. The black frost it emitted was constantly repairing the wounds on his internal organs, but it could only treat the symptoms. He was currently very weak. His heartbeat and breathing were extremely slow. It was very similar to those cold-blooded animals before the arrival of winter. This meant that hibernation was about to arrive. The method the black dragon used to save him was hibernation. Hibernation was sleeping. What he needed the most right now was a good sleep, until the sky turned dark and the earth turned dark, until the end of time. But he could not sleep. Because she was sleeping, he had to be awake. This feeling was very painful. Wanting to sleep, but not being able to sleep. How beautiful was that scene? As the most effective method of punishment, one could only imagine how difficult it was to endure. In order to keep his heavy eyelids from closing, Chen Changsheng made even more efforts and attempts. He slapped his face, washed his face, pinched his legs, tried to focus his mind. It was only until his divine sense fell upon the black stone that he instantly and truly awoke. The black stone and the notebook were placed together in an extremely remote corner of his world. If one did not carefully search for them, it would be easy to miss them. Perhaps it was for this reason, or perhaps it was because even when he was on the verge of death, he instinctively knew that they were precious. Yesterday, he did not throw the black stone and notebook along with the other items into the two wings of light to help him escape. From Xining village to the capital, breaking off the engagement had never been an important matter. For him, what was important was the grand examination, because only then could he quietly contemplate for a night in the pavilion of ascending mist. For this, he had expended an unimaginable amount of time and effort. Finally, he had achieved this seemingly inconceivable goal. However, compared to the price he had previously paid, his gains from the pavilion of ascending mist were rather pitiful. He had not been able to directly find the secret to defying the heavens and changing fate. He had only obtained this black stone and the notebook. Therefore, he would naturally treasure the black stone and the notebook. He hoped that he could obtain even more from them. Reality seemed to be the same. On that night, when he was viewing the monoliths in the front mausoleum of the Mausoleum of Books, those monoliths had floated within his sea of consciousness. However, they had never been able to fill that starry sky. It was at that time that the black stone had played an extremely important role in helping him break through to the upper level of ethereal opening. Then what about this notebook? Position is relative. This was the first sentence in the opening of Wang Zhi's notebook, and it was also the sentence that left the deepest impression on him. He gazed at the grassland that was so thick that it could not be melted and silently pondered over this sentence. He did not discover anything, but he suddenly remembered that yesterday he and Zheshio had jumped into the cold pool from the top of the cliff. In the end, they had swam out from the surface of the lake. In order to avoid the pursuit of Nank's two maids, he had continuously sunk to the bottom of the lake. In the end, when he had returned here, he had jumped into the night sky. Position was relative and also opposite. Could it be that the world of the Garden of Zhou was not a plane, but a combination of two opposite planes? With the cliff at the very top of the stream as the boundary, on that side, the lake and mountains were one world, while on this side, the mountains, rivers, and grassland were the opposite world. The passage between the two worlds was that cold pool, as well as the pond over Tenli in front of Sunset Valley. Qin Changsheng silently calculated these worlds in his heart. Immediately after, he thought about why he and Zheshio had gone to the world on the other side of the cliff yesterday, and why they had returned to the world on the front side of the Garden of Zhou from that world. It was all because of a strand of sword intent. At first, he had chased after the sword intent, but in the end, he seemed to have been brought out by the sword intent. Last night, in the depths of the lake, when he was on the verge of death, there had been a strange change at the very last moment. How could he forget it? He lowered his head to look at the metal ball in his palm. He gently stroked it and seemed to be deep in thought. With a slight movement of his spiritual sense, a series of fine and concentrated sounds of friction and collision rang out. In an instant, the yellow paper umbrella appeared in his hand. After a moment of silence, he stood up, took the yellow paper umbrella, and extended it forward. The yellow paper umbrella did not have any reaction. He turned his body, and the yellow paper umbrella slowly moved through the air, bringing with it several gusts of wind. When a yellow paper umbrella pointed towards what he thought was the southwest direction, it suddenly stopped. It was not that he wanted the yellow paper umbrella to stop, but that the yellow paper umbrella did not seem to want to move anymore. Even the wind on the pile of grass had suddenly disappeared without a trace. A slight but clear tremor traveled from the umbrella to the umbrella ribs, then to the handle, to his hand, and finally to his heart. A strand of sword intent appeared in the distance. This strand of sword intent was very faint, just like the one he had felt yesterday by the cold pool, but it was also very strong, causing him to instinctively feel a sense of reverence. That sword intent was soundless, as if it had already been there for countless years. However, its appearance in itself represented a kind of summoning. Qin Changsheng thought of the scene of the yellow paper umbrella carrying him as he madly ran at the last moment of last night. He muttered, "Is this strand of sword intent looking for you?" After a moment of silence, he looked at the yellow paper umbrella and said, "Or could it be that you're using it to find this strand of sword intent?" The design of a yellow paper umbrella is really too interesting. I've always liked umbrellas, all kinds of umbrellas, because umbrellas can play many roles. For example, the current radar. Chapter 297. The space within the grassland was constantly changing. Apart from the monsters that had always lived within, it was very difficult for intelligent beings from the outside to understand the pattern of these changes. It was still the same old saying, without direction, it was naturally impossible to find a way out. Just as Chun Changsheng was feeling distressed over this, the yellow paper umbrella suddenly pointed towards a certain direction. Walking towards that direction was not necessarily the best choice, or even the correct choice, but now that he had a direction, it was much better than walking aimlessly before. It was like a difficult exercise. You bitterly pondered over it, but could not find a solution. Then suddenly a classmate gave you an answer. You could not be sure if he was lying to you or comforting you. But besides copying the answer onto a piece of paper, what other choice did you have? What's more, that strand of sword intent really did exist. What grudge did the yellow paper umbrella have to bring him into a dead end? With this, Chun Changsheng determined the direction he should walk in. Although his body was still weak and drowsiness was like a snake pressing down on his body, his mood was much more stable. He sat down beside Su Yurong, leaning against the crystal, forcefully resisting his drowsiness, and stared into her eyes, waiting for her to wake up. After an unknown amount of time, Su Yurong's eyelashes trembled slightly, and she woke up. Those two clear, watery eyes that were like fresh rain fell into Chun Changsheng's eyes, causing him to be slightly stunned and speechless. Just like the moment when Chun Changsheng woke up in the cliff cave, the two were very close, their eyes looking at each other. But the young girl's eyes did not show any panic, no shyness, no wariness, and definitely no fear. There was only calmness. Her eyes were very clear, not tainted by a single speck of dust or worldly wisdom, like a newborn baby, but this touch of calmness gave off a feeling of having seen through the mortal world, of having experienced the affairs of the world for a long time, like an old man watching the rain. These two feelings did not conflict, but fused together, forming a mysterious and indescribable charm. Perhaps it was because he was too tired, or perhaps it was because this pair of eyes was too enchanting, but Chun Changsheng did not shift his gaze. The youth and the young girl lay on a pile of grass, separated by less than a foot, quietly looking at each other. But in the end, they could not continue looking at each other like this forever. Interestingly, the first one to become shy, or perhaps nervous, was Chun Changsheng. He shifted his gaze away uncomfortably and looked at the grass not far away, saying, "You're awake?" Of course, she had already woken up. He had only said these words because he had nothing else to say. Just like Zheshio on the other side of the plains, Chun Changsheng was also not very good at talking, especially when he was with a woman. However, these words definitely had another meaning. Su Yurong grunted softly. Chun Changsheng said, "Then let's change shifts." Su Yurong raised her eyebrows slightly. Chun Changsheng said, "You've slept for so long, it's my turn to sleep." When he woke up in the cave, he knew that it was this girl who had saved him. Then, the girl left him a few words and fell into a long sleep. This made him feel great pressure, as if the two of them had both fallen on his shoulders. Only now, when he confirmed that she was really awake, did he finally relax a little. He had completely returned the two of them to the awake her, so he should be able to rest for a while. With this thought, a tiredness washed over him like a tide, instantly drowning all the pores, muscles, bones, and spiritual world from his head to his toes. Without waiting for Su Yurong to say anything, he closed his eyes and began to sleep, or perhaps it was better to say that he fainted. Just like Chun Changsheng outside the cave, Su Yurong was not mentally prepared for his sleep at all. After staring blankly for a while, she awoke from her stupor and supported herself against a pile of grass to sit up with some difficulty. Only then did she realize that she was surrounded by precious crystals. She looked around and realized that she had already arrived in the plains. This made her fall into another long period of silence. In the end, she had still entered the plains. Then was there still a possibility of leaving? Relying on her bright Tao heart, she expelled all these chaotic thoughts from her sea of consciousness and began to meditate. She discovered that although her vision was clearer than it was this morning, the poison that Nank had planted in her body had not disappeared. It was still constantly corroding her body and sea of consciousness. The greatest problem was that her blood was clearly showing signs of drying up. It was not that she had used up too much true essence, although that was indeed the case, but that her blood was about to run out. Blood was the reason for living, and without blood, there was no reason for living. In reality, according to her injuries in the morning, she should still be in a state of unconsciousness and should not have woken up. Once she woke up, her body would require even more blood. Since she had woken up, it meant that her condition had improved. She looked at the mutilated body of the snake on the grass and muttered to herself. She could roughly guess what had happened, and her gaze towards Chun Changsheng was filled with a few more hints of kindness. They were both human cultivators, being pursued by the demon race. It was natural for them to help each other. Chun Changsheng had already used reality to prove that he was not a person who would abandon his companions, so she obviously had to repay him. Her right hand lightly fell on his pulse. Chun Changsheng's pulse was rather sluggish, at least 3 times slower than a normal person's, but it was extremely stable. Although it was somewhat weak and chaotic, it was completely different from a person on the verge of death. Early in the morning, in the reeds, she had taken his pulse and used the fated star plate to calculate. This person should not have long to live, so why was he still alive and well? She thought for a moment and felt that it should have something to do with the cold essence of pure Yin in his body. She looked towards Chun Changsheng and thought that the continent was indeed full of hidden dragons and crouching tigers. The Snow Mountain sect, which had long lost its former glory, still could not be underestimated. At the same time she looked over, a loud snoring sound came from the grass. Chun Changsheng had carried her on his back for such a long time with his heavily injured body, and also had to resist the black dragon's hibernation technique. Chun Changsheng was already exhausted to the extreme. Now that he was relaxed, he actually slept very soundly. Not to mention his thunderous snoring. Even if there was real thunder, it would not be able to wake him up. Chun Changsheng, who was sleeping soundly, would occasionally smack his lips as if he was eating something good in his dreams. He would also occasionally clench his fists and kick his legs. He really looked like a baby, causing Su Yurong to smile. Yet at this moment, from the depths of the grassland, or more accurately, from far away, came the sound of a zither. Su Yurong's expression did not change, but a hint of wariness appeared in her eyes. She could not forget that the zither-playing elder was an elder of the Candle Shadow Shaman, and that the shaman race was most skilled in controlling poisons and monsters. The space within the plains of the unsetting sun was distorted. She had only woken up for a moment, but she had already understood the mysteries within. However, the distorted space could not block out sound, and those monsters hidden within the grassland definitely had some sort of method to move freely. Her watery gaze fell upon the surface of the water. A chill gradually grew because ripples had gradually appeared on the calm surface of the water. Those shallow ripples seemed to have many little insects walking about, but in reality, there was nothing on the surface of the water. These ripples originated from a very distant place, or perhaps from very deep underground. An extremely condensed strand of divine sense followed her gaze and spread into the distance, entering the thick grass and the wet mud under the ground. Perception had always been two-sided, so those beings in the dense underbrush and the depths of the mud could clearly sense her chi. It was an incomparably dignified, powerful, and noble chi that originated from ancient times. A few uneasy sounds came from the distant grassland, and then there were countless tiny sounds of friction. Some of the vibrations beneath the ground were also silently moving away. Su Yurong's chi spread throughout the grassland in a crushing manner. Many monsters that had been startled awake by the sound of the zither scattered in all directions in search of prey, but there were still many monsters that did not change their direction. Su Yurong's chi was unquestionably the most noble and powerful, But when she was in a weakened state, she was also the most delicious to these monsters. If someone were to look at the prairie from the sky, they would be able to see that within an area of several tens of miles, there were countless monsters hidden. Like a tide, they slowly surrounded the place where she and Chun Changsheng were. What made one's hair stand on end was that even though there were so many monsters moving, they didn't make any sound. A gust of wind blew through the grass, and a pair of wings as white as snow appeared on her back. In her previous slumber, she had recovered some of her true essence and regained some of her blood. She unhesitatingly used it all up. She gazed at Chen Changsheng, preparing to grab his belt, but for some reason, she stopped halfway. The grassland with a circumference of several dozen li had already been turned into a battlefield by the tens of thousands of monsters. However, the true danger lay outside the battlefield, in an even further place. Those lush water grasses cast an extremely thick shadow on the surface of the water, and in the shadow lurked several hundred demon vultures. These demon vultures were covered in gray fur, and their beaks were even sharper than ordinary swords. Even more terrifying were the gazes of these demon vultures. They were cold and cruel and extremely sharp. Neither swords nor their own sharp edges could compare to them. These monsters had extremely high intelligence. Their attacks were extremely strange, and their flying speed was extremely high. In the outside world, they lived in the mountains of the northeast. A single demon vulture was enough to kill a normal meditation cultivator. Fortunately, there were very few demon vultures in the eastern continent, but who could have imagined that there would be so many in the Garden of Zhou? Not a single one of the several hundred demon vultures flapped their wings. They only stared at a certain place in the depths of the grassland. Their eyes were cold and bloodthirsty, so quiet that it was terrifying. Even further away, the faint sound of the zither floated over. In the water grasses, the silhouettes of the gray vultures seemed incomparably sinister. Su Yurong turned around and gazed into the distance. She did not know what sort of dangers were hidden over there, nor did she take out her faded star plate. However, she had a feeling that flying away was not a good choice. She was currently heavily injured and had no way of displaying her full speed. Moreover, she was unable to clearly distinguish the direction of the grassland. If she chose to fly, then there really was a chance that she would die in the sky. The azure sky above the grassland seemed to be boundlessly vast, allowing one to fly freely, but it was actually very dangerous. If she was alone, she might have been able to successfully leave, but right now, there was a youth sleeping behind her, snoring like thunder. Today is the winter solstice. I wish everyone happiness. I will write a bit more. The next chapter will be posted in half an hour. Chapter 298. Su Yurong sat back down and took out the tong bow and Wu arrows. She lowered her head in silence, not saying a single word. Chun Changsheng was behind her, surrounded by countless crystals. Time slowly passed. The monsters hidden in the grassland, because of their innate fear of her qi, did not attack. The ethereal sound of the zither did not become berserk, urging them to attack. Instead, it grew even calmer, as if it was pacifying them. It pacified the hearts of the monsters, dispelling their fear and giving birth to sufficient courage. The surface of the water amidst the grass suddenly began to fiercely tremble. Those faint ripples from before instantly connected into one, forming an extremely high wave. The wave surged over the pile of grass, wetting the hem of her skirt that hung in front of her knees. She raised her head and opened her eyes, calmly gazing into the depths of the lake. She bent her bow, knocked an arrow, and slightly loosened her fingers. There was a light whooshing sound. The Wu arrow pierced through the air, piercing deeply into the water. There was nothing in the water, so what was this arrow shooting at? Could it be water? In the next moment, the waves on the surface of the water actually disappeared, the waves no longer surging. It was as if the water had truly been calmed by her arrow. Su Yurong's Wu arrow was naturally not aimed at the water, nor at the waves, but at the monsters that were attempting to stir up the waves. The clear water was slowly dyed red. The corpse of a flood serpent slowly floated up, lying in the sea of grass, as massive as a city wall. A wu arrow was lodged between its eyes, deeply embedded in its feathers. Compared to the massive body of this flood serpent, this arrow seemed like a thin blade of grass. However, it was this arrow that easily killed the flood serpent. This was not the end, but the beginning. In the next moment, the surface of the water began to fiercely tremble, countless splashes appearing everywhere, accompanied by heart-palpitating howls of anger. Several dozen massive shadows broke through the water, descending towards the pile of grass. Each massive shadow was a flood serpent. Each flood serpent's head seemed even larger than the pile of grass that Su Yurong and Chen Changsheng were on. Several dozen flood serpents broke through the water, covering the sky as they descended, their momentum astonishing. Compared to them, the bow-wielding girl atop the pile of grass seemed minuscule. The flood serpent was a very famous demonic beast on the continent because its skin could be used to make the highest grade of armor. From this, it could be seen that the flood serpent's defensive abilities were extremely strong. Its seemingly smooth and soft snakeskin was actually extremely tough. Not to mention normal weapons. Even a normal nether passage cultivator would find it difficult to pierce through it. Following the humans, demons, and demi-humans, these intelligent life forms that ruled over the eastern continent, the majority of the flood serpents now hid themselves in remote and desolate mountains. However, they were still infamous. Who would have thought that in the plains of the Garden of Zhou, there would be so many flood serpents? And these flood serpents were only a portion of the monsters in the plains. It was no wonder that none of the Nether Passage realm cultivators who had entered the grasslands in the past few centuries had been able to come out alive. It was rumored that the flood serpent had the bloodline of the Dragon Clan, but they were restricted by the Dragon Clan. Their divine soul could never awaken, and they could only live in the water. Perhaps it was because of this reason that they hated the bloodline of the Dragon Clan and the Phoenix Clan the most. This was probably why they were the first to attack Su Yurong. Dozens of flood serpents attacked. The entire sky seemed to be covered, and the light became dim. Su Yurong's quiver only had a dozen or so wu arrows. How could they deal with these powerful monsters? This was a problem, but she very quickly resolved it. Since she did not have enough arrows, she would not use them. Seeing the massive shadows that whistled through the air, her expression was calm. She once again drew her bow, but this time there were no arrows on the bowstring. Her movements were still steady and concise. There was nothing superfluous, and she did not waste a single shred of true essence or strength. Every time she drew her bow, it was like a duplicate of the first time she drew her bow. There was no difference, except where the tong bow pointed. Clang, 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 clang. The bowstring was plucked like a zither. It rang out, playing a monotonous yet unyielding music. Countless white slashes left the bowstring and pierced through the air, landing on the bodies of those massive flood serpents. The flood serpents were incomparably tough. Even ethereal opening cultivators could not cut through their outer skin, but upon contact with those white slashes, they began to split apart. Those white slashes were like cracks in space, possessing the power to cut through everything. In an instant, countless bloody wounds appeared on the bodies of those dozens of massive flood serpents. Snake blood rained down like a majestic rain. Within those wounds, one could see the twisted flesh as well as the dense white bones. This scene was exceptionally bloody and terrifying. The dozens of flood serpents were in extreme pain. Their upper halves were violently twisting in the air, while their lower halves were stirring up massive waves in the water. The turbid waves pierced through the air, followed closely by the most frenzied attacks of the wounded flood serpents. Su Yurong sat amidst the grass, her expression serene. She was not afraid, nor did she have any intention of dodging. However, the movement of her bowstring suddenly became even faster. Her right hand transformed into a blur, and it was impossible to clearly see her movements. Clang, 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 clang. Hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of white slashes left the bowstring, scattering through the air around the pile of grass. Those flood serpents simply had no way of approaching the pile of grass. They were cut into chunks the size of boulders. With a grinding sound, They were cut into countless chunks and then transformed into meteors that rained down from the sky. Explosions rang out without end. The severed bodies of countless flood serpents created massive waves. Only after a long time did the surface of the water gradually calm down. The surface of the water had long since been dyed red by the blood of the serpents. It was now gradually turning black and suffused with an unbearable stench, like cheap and inferior ink. Several dozen massive flood serpents blotted out the sky. The heavily injured Su Yurong seemed incapable of resisting and could only become food along with the sleeping Chun Changshan. But who could have imagined that in her weakened state, she could casually pull the bowstring and transform these terrifying monsters into chunks of meat? Of course, while her tong bow seemed to be drawn casually, it actually consumed an extreme amount of energy. Moreover, this was still not the end. The ink-like surface of the water began to tremble once more, creating even more ripples. The ripples crisscrossed everywhere, forming a complex and indescribable diagram. Under the urging of the zither, the countless demon beasts hidden in the grassland continued to surge forward like a tide. Su Yurong glanced at Chun Changsheng, a hint of confusion and self-mockery appearing on her calm face. She was confused about Chun Changsheng. She had clearly deduced from the fated star plate that this person's life had come to an end. So why was he still alive? So much so that she could not easily leave. She was also confused about herself. She clearly knew that this youth from the Snow Mountain sect would die. So why could she not abandon him? From last night until now, she could ignore him at any time. So why couldn't she? Self-mockery was obviously directed at herself. She recalled that when she was a child in the capital, the Empress would often say that her heart was too soft, that this was not good. Later on, when she went to South Stream Temple, the Holy Maiden would often say that her heart was too hard, that this was not good. Then, was her heart soft or hard? Perhaps this uncertainty and wavering was Nank's way of saying that she was petty? Just as she was thinking about these things, a sharp, ear-piercing sound came from the gloomy sky of the plains. She raised her head and saw several hundred demon vultures flying in her direction. This time, the sky had truly been completely obscured, leaving not a single crack. It was gloomy to an eerie degree, but at the same time, it made her eyes even calmer, so much so that they seemed somewhat indifferent. Yes, there's still the third chapter today, but I don't know when it will be updated. Chapter 299. The demon vultures were even more frightening and powerful than the flood serpents. They were as fast as lightning, and their attacks were incomparably bizarre. If she wanted to survive the encirclement of several hundred demon vultures, the best method was not to dodge, but to kill them as quickly as possible. Thus, her methods had to be faster and more sudden than lightning, more berserk than a tempest. She silently gazed at the sky, filled with vultures, her pure white wings slowly flapping behind her. Besides the flood serpents and demon vultures, there were assuredly even more powerful monsters in the plains of the unsetting sun, but she could not save her most powerful move for that time. Without the slightest hesitation, a bright flame appeared in the depths of her eyes, temporarily suppressing even the dark green poison. Swish, 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 swish. Countless white feathers left the body of the wings, transforming into countless sharp arrows that flew into the sky. 10,000 feathers of the phoenix. The several hundred demon vultures sensed the divine chi in these white feathers and scattered in panic. The sky returned to its azure blue state. But those demon vultures could no longer see the sky, because those phoenix feathers were too fast, even faster than lightning. The azure sky began to glow with countless specks of holy light. Those white feathers stabbed into the bodies of the demon vultures like sharp arrows, cleaving through their feathers like sharp blades. For a moment, the sky was filled with images of severed beaks and severed wings. Countless flowers of blood blossomed like fireworks. But Su Yurong no longer paid any attention, no longer glancing at the sky. At some point, the crystals on the grass began to emit pure and warm rays of light that poured into her body. She gazed at the surrounding plains and calmly drew the tong bow once more. The sun in the plains of the unsetting sun did not set, so there was no sunset, but there was dusk when the sun would turn into a ball of light and the world would be much dimmer. At dusk, the entire sea of grass would be dyed red. No matter how mournful and unyielding that distant zither music was, the monsters finally retreated. They had come like a tide and left like a tide, instantly vanishing without a trace. At least thousands of demon beasts had died in the surrounding sea of grass. Most of the corpses were dragged away by demon beasts of other clans or even their own companions as food. But because there were too many of them, there were still many remains of demon beasts in the sea of grass. The dirty blood gradually sank into the mud, and the blood foam left behind by the waves on the edge of the grass pile did not disappear. The dusky light shone from the distant horizon of the grassland, making the scene seem even more bloody. Su Yurong's face was very pale. It was unknown whether it was because of the disgust from what had just happened or because of her injuries. The crystals around her had all turned into grayish-white powder, and there was no longer any trace of energy in them. She slowly put down the tong bow and used her fingers to pick up some of the powder from the crystal. She lightly rubbed it between her fingers to relieve the pain and treat the wounds made by the bowstring. If she didn't have these crystals, she definitely wouldn't be able to repel this beast tide. In truth, other than the Li Palace, the Imperial Palace, Holy Maiden Peak, and the Longevity Sect, she had never seen so many crystals before. The number of crystals was truly a little ridiculous. She gazed at the still, sleeping Chan Changsheng and silently thought to herself, the Snow Mountain Sect was indeed worthy of being a sect with 10,000 years of history. Just like their Black Frost Dragon, they truly cared about collecting crystals and precious treasures. This disciple of the Snow Mountain Sect's secret sect was actually able to carry so many crystals with him. The pure white phoenix feather had already been retracted into her body. For a short period of time, or even for a long period of time that she could predict the future, she would not be able to use it again. At this moment, she was already exhausted to the extreme. Her true essence had already been used up, and her blood had already dried up. She had truly reached the state of a lamp without oil. If another enemy appeared, she would undoubtedly die. She didn't even have the strength to move to the center of the grass pile. She didn't even have the time to take off the longbow from her shoulder. She hugged her knees and sat by the water's edge, allowing the disgusting bloody foam to wet her skirt. As if there was some sort of connection between them, just when she was at her most helpless, most in need of help, and most in need of rest, Chun Changsheng woke up. She didn't even turn around to know that he had opened his eyes. She said, "You're awake?" Although he was in the plains of the Garden of Zhou, not in Xining Village's old temple, nor in the Orthodox Academy, Chun Changsheng still habitually, or perhaps stubbornly, used 5 breaths of time to calm his mind, and then looked over. Just by glancing at her from the grass, he felt an intense regret and apology. He realized that he shouldn't have wasted those 5 breaths of time. Su Yurong hugged her knees and sat by the edge of the grass pile. She allowed the bloody foam to slap against her. Her figure seemed especially lonely and pitiful. "Yes, I'm awake." Qin Changsheng stood up and walked towards her. He wanted to walk as fast as possible, but because of the cold of the black frost, his body seemed to be frozen stiff. Su Yurong still didn't turn her head, because she was already so tired that she didn't even have the strength to turn her head. She softly said, "Then let's change shifts." After saying this, she slightly turned her body, hugged her knees, and rested her face on them. Just like that, she fell asleep without moving. Qin Changsheng walked to her side and looked at her tightly closed eyes and snow-white face. He was silent for a while. He gently untied her longbow. His right hand reached into the crook of her leg, and his left hand supported her shoulder. He lifted her horizontally from the edge of the grass pile that was suffused with bloody foam. In this process, she did not wake up, nor did her eyelashes blink. When he put her down, she still maintained the position of hugging her knees and sleeping. The white hair was as good as new, and the clothes were as good as new. A stranger who had not spoken much, who did not even know the other's name, could entrust his entire life to her. It only depended on what kind of person the other person was, how much trust the other person could give you, and how much trust you were willing to give back. Up until now, they had not spoken many words, but when he woke up, she could sleep at ease. When she woke up, he could snore like thunder. At the very beginning, she had saved him, and then he had done his best to protect her. In this process, trust was naturally established, and it was becoming more and more solid. Chen Changsheng deeply cherished this feeling of being trusted. He unsheathed his dagger from its sheath and tightly gripped it in his hand. Sitting in front of her, he gazed at the increasingly dusky plains. At this time, he saw the sea of grass that had already been dyed black with blood, saw the remains of those monsters, and roughly understood what had happened while he was asleep. He was silent for a very long time. The archery of the elf race was truly wondrous beyond words, but when he had untied the longbow for her, he had felt that the bowstring was still warm. In this battle that he had not seen, just how many times had she drawn the bow? How many times had she shot the arrow? How had she managed to endure? Night finally truly arrived. The sun hanging over the edge of the plains grew even dimmer. Although it had not sunk, the amount of light that fell upon the plains was much less. He sat in front of her, calmly gazing at the darkness of the plains, waiting for the battle that could occur at any moment. Time slowly passed. The ball of light hanging over the edge of the plains slowly circled around. For some reason, it suddenly disappeared. It had been obscured by dark clouds. Perhaps because they had been slaughtered too wretchedly during the day, the monsters did not launch another attack. Instead, rain began to fall from the sky. The climate of the plains was relatively warm, but the rain falling from the sky was still somewhat cold. With the current state of his and Su Yorong's bodies, if they were drenched, they might actually catch a serious illness. Without even thinking about it, he opened a yellow paper umbrella and held it above Su Yorong. However, this position was somewhat uncomfortable. No matter how large the yellow paper umbrella was, it could not block out all the rain. Seeing her dress gradually drenched by the rain, he still stood up without even thinking about it. The cold rain fell upon the sea of grass, striking out countless rings of water. As it fell upon the pile of grass, it brought forth an endless chill. With his left hand holding the yellow paper umbrella, he stood behind her. With his right hand holding the dagger, he gazed at the world in the heavy rain. The entire night passed, and he maintained this position the entire time. The monsters still did not appear. Morning finally arrived. The dark clouds dispersed, and the azure sky reappeared in front of their eyes. The halo of light at the edge of the plains gradually became clearer. The edges sharpened, and the morning sun took shape. The warm red light gradually dried the pile of grass that was drenched by the cold rain and the wetness in Chen Changsheng's clothes. Su Yorong woke up. Looking at his pale face, she was a little confused. There was no battle last night, so why did his injury seem to have gotten worse? Chen Changsheng did not explain that he had been holding the umbrella the entire night. The cold rain had drenched his back. Starting from the night before, they had been constantly fleeing or fighting. One person was unconscious and one person was awake. This was actually the first time they had a conversation in a conscious state. The conversation in the cliff cave was, after all, too short. Although they already trusted each other greatly, and even had some sort of tacit understanding, when they were awake, they would realize that they were still strangers. Therefore, it was hard to avoid a sense of alienation. Chen Changsheng recalled the scene when he met Tang 36 in the Plum Garden Inn in the capital. That was the first time in his life that he had interacted with a stranger, the first time he had tried making small talk. Although it seemed rather clumsy in hindsight, he at least understood a few basic principles, such as the need to always speak to break the silence. In this dangerous plane, small talk was an unacceptable waste of time. He directly asked, "What do you know about these planes?" Elves were the closest to nature. It was rumored that they could communicate with plants, so he wanted to hear what she thought. Su Yorong shook her head. "No one understands these planes." Chen Changsheng said, "If you don't mind, can you let me decide the direction?" Su Yorong was a little confused. She looked at him and asked, "You know where to go?" Chen Changsheng did not explain too much. He said, "I have a general direction." Just when Su Yorong was about to say something, she suddenly sensed a chi several hundred zhang away. It was Nang's chi. The space and time in the plains of the unsetting sun were rather strange. It seemed to be only several hundred zhang away, but in reality, it was still very far away. But she still sensed it. She said no more, expressing her agreement with Chun Changsheng's decision. However, she did not get up. Chun Changsheng understood that she was currently too weak and her injuries were too heavy. It would be very difficult for her to move freely in a short period of time, so he did not understand. Clearly, in these circumstances, how could she have killed so many monsters yesterday? He turned around and said, "If you don't mind. TSK, I won't say anything else. I'll have to trouble everyone to vote for me. Thank you, everyone." Chapter 300. Su Rong said, "Your face is as white as snow. How can I not mind?" Chun Changsheng turned to look at her and said, "You're not much better off. Your face is as white as the frost on the grass." Su Rong was slightly taken aback. Looking at her reflection in the water, she discovered that her face was indeed strangely pale. She subconsciously covered her cheeks with her hands. This was a young girl's subconscious action, but in Chun Changsheng's eyes, it was very cute. "Thank you." She came to her senses, held his shoulder, and leaned on his back. "I'm sorry." He wrapped his hand around her knee and pulled her up a bit. Just like this, they left the pile of grass, stepped through the bloody sea of grass, and went to a clear place. The water in the sea of grass was not deep. The shallow parts were knee-deep, and the deep parts were only waist-deep. It was just that the mud at the bottom was too soft. Chun Changsheng was carrying a person on his back and still had to hold the umbrella in his left hand, so it was somewhat difficult to walk. Fortunately, the sun had risen for some time, and the temperature in the sea of grass gradually rose. It was very comfortable, and, as far as the eye could see, there was tender green. Walking in the spring light and spring water, no matter how difficult it was somewhat comforting. If it weren't for those sounds, perhaps they would have felt more like they were walking. The faint whistling of the air came from the plains behind them, coming from Nang's wings. Whether it was Chun Changsheng or Su Rong, after understanding the plains of the unsetting sun, they were not worried that the demon experts would quickly catch up. On the contrary, the small sounds around the sea of grass made them even more vigilant. Those sounds belonged to the natives of the sea of grass. Yesterday, Su Rong had killed many monsters, but she had paid a great price for it. At the same time, she knew that there were definitely even stronger monsters living in the plains, perhaps even existences that ethereal opening cultivators could not resist. Chun Changsheng held up the yellow paper umbrella, feeling for the position of the sword intent, and continued forward into the plains. The sun had already moved to the middle of the sky, but the sunlight was not scorching. It was as warm and comfortable as a spring day. Su Rong did not understand why he kept holding up this shabby umbrella. Was he worried that she would get sunburned? Or was it that the cold chi of black frost that this youth cultivated conflicted with the sunlight? If it involved the unique cultivation method of the Snow Mountain sect, then it was naturally inconvenient for her to say too much, but there was one thing she had to ask: just where are we going? Chun Changsheng said, to the sword pool. In his opinion, the location of the sword pool was very likely to be the legendary sword pool. If there really was a sword pool in the Garden of Zhou that had never been found, then it was very obvious that the sword pool was most likely in this plain that no one had ever walked out of. Su Yurong also understood this point, but she could not understand how he could determine the position of the sword pool. Chun Changsheng did not answer this question. It was not that he did not want her to know the secret of the yellow paper umbrella, but rather that the sword pool was no ordinary treasure trove. After 2 days and 1 night of fleeing, he could entrust his life to this girl and give her sufficient trust. However, it was precisely because of this that there was no need to add these bargaining chips to test her character. Human nature could not be tested. Every time it was tested, there was a possibility that the person would take a step in the opposite direction of the person who set the question. Similarly, trust could not be used. Every time it was used, it was a test of trust. As they walked, the water in the sea of grass gradually decreased, and the ground gradually increased. Only then did it feel like a grassland. As they walked through the dense grass, Chun Changsheng felt much more at ease as he felt the soles of his shoes steady. However, the rustling sounds in the grassland grew louder and louder. It was very obvious that there were even more monsters hidden in the surroundings than in the wetlands, and perhaps even more vicious. Su Yurong took out the tong bao and calmly observed her surroundings, ready to strike at any time. However, for some reason, even after Chun Changsheng had carried her for several dozen li, those monsters still did not launch any attacks. They did not even approach them. There were even 3 times when she could clearly sense the extremely terrifying qi exuded by the monsters that were observing them. Even at her peak, she was still not a match for those monsters. Why did these powerful monsters not come and kill her? In the past, she might have believed that the qi exuded by the true blood of the heavenly phoenix in her body had directly suppressed the greed of those monsters. However, now that the blood in her body was almost completely drained, what were those monsters afraid of? The two continued forward. The ground of the grassland grew drier and drier, while the height of the grass decreased. Moreover, it gradually became sparse. Finally, they arrived at a patch of grass that barely reached their feet. The grass was grayish-white in color, but it had not withered. It was as if it was the hair of an old man. In the green grassland, these short grayish-white grasses were extremely eye-catching. Moreover, from their feet to the extremely distant depths of the grassland, they formed a clear path. They did not know where this path made of white grass led to, or what dangers were hidden within. Su Yurong said, if that person really is dead, then this path might lead to his tomb. Chen Changxing understood why she had such a guess. In the afterlife scripture of the essay on the origin of the Tao, there was a saying, white grass as a path, straight to the sea of stars. If Zhou Dufu really was dead and really was buried in this world, then his tomb was most likely to be in the depths of this grassland. This white grass path represented the path to death. There was also another powerful proof, which came from the slight trembling of the yellow paper umbrella. That strand of sword intent was in the distance of this white grass path. If that strand of sword intent indicated the location of the sword pool, then it was extremely logical. The millions of swords sleeping in the sword pool were Zhou Dufu's spoils of war. Of course, they were also the best offering for him. There is no sea of stars in the garden of Zhou, but the sword pool is the sea of stars. He agreed with Su Yurong's opinion. It seems that we have to walk to the end of this white grass path to know whether it's death or something else. Su Yurong did not think that he would so quickly realize that the basis of her judgment came from the essay on the origin of the Tao. She gave him a somewhat appreciative glance. Whether it was towards the sea of stars or death, they were both extremely far away. This white grass path was naturally very long. Chun Changsheng carried her for a very long time, yet he still seemed to be at the beginning. The sun of the plains of the unsetting sun rose and then set, but it did not disappear. It circled around the plains, then rose and set again. They walked, and walked again. When they were thirsty, they would drink some clean water from the puddles on the side of the path. When they were hungry, Chun Changsheng would get some beast meat to eat. When they were drowsy, he would sleep for a while. She would quietly sit on the side. When she was tired, he would wake up. This cycle repeated. Chun Changsheng's injuries improved slightly, but she remained extremely weak. On a certain day, it was nighttime again. It was not a true night, but the light had become somewhat gloomy. Suddenly, rain began to fall from the sky. Chun Changsheng carried her on his back and ran through the night rain. At some point, the yellow paper umbrella was in her hand, shielding them from the wind and rain. Tonight's rain was too fierce. Just an umbrella was not enough to shield them. But in this world of weeds and smoke, where could they find shelter from the rain? Just at this moment, they broke through the curtain of rain and saw a temple. The next chapter has already been written. It needs to be revised. It will be updated in about 20 minutes. Chapter 301. It was a shabby little temple. It had been severely eroded by the wind and rain. One could only faintly see the original rules and purpose from the remains of the sacrificial beast on the eaves. Standing in front of the temple in the rain, Chun Changsheng and Su Yurong did not speak. It was very quiet. This was a sacrificial temple. With white grass as the road, it led directly to the sea of stars. One sacrifice for 1,000 li. This shabby sacrificial temple was on the side of the white grass road. This meant that their guess was correct. This road did indeed lead to a mausoleum. Not all tombs could be called mausoleums. In the past 1,000 years, other than the 3 emperors of the Great Zhou dynasty, only one person dared to call his own tomb a mausoleum and build it according to the rules. No one dared to object. Of course, that person was Zhou Dufu. Is this the legendary temple of first sacrifice? Qin Changsheng looked at the shabby temple in the rain and murmured. The 3 imperial mausoleums of the Great Zhou dynasty each had their own grandeur. However, the temple of first sacrifice that was 1,000 li away had long been torn down by the divine empress. This was because the empress felt that a temple 1,000 li away, other than being used to raise a bunch of useless officials from the Board of Rites, had no meaning and was extremely wasteful. This matter was as clean and efficient as when she sent Zhou Tong to tear down the monolith hut in the Mausoleum of Books. It was very reasonable, but also very unreasonable. This shabby little temple was probably the only temple of first sacrifice in the entire continent. The rain continued to fall, getting heavier and heavier. The wheel of light on the distant grassland had long since disappeared. The world was dark. Qin Changsheng stood in the rain with Su Yurong on his back. He did not enter the temple to hide from the rain. In the past, there must have been many outstanding human cultivators or demon experts like them who found this white grass road and saw this temple. Then, those people continued to advance towards the mausoleum. In the end, they all died. He asked, "Can we turn back?" "No, this is a road of no return." Su Yurong shook her head. The last 2 times Qin Changsheng had fallen asleep, she had used the fated star plate to make calculations. The results of the calculations were very bad. Although she could not accurately calculate her own fate, his fate was still gloomy. Moreover, if they did not continue forward and turn back, they would definitely be lost in this grassland. They could only continue forward. Would they meet the same end as those people before them? Apart from the pitter-patter of rain, there was no other sound in front of the temple. Qin Changsheng and Su Yurong's expressions gradually became calm. Their eyes gradually became tranquil and calm again. There was no question, no answer, no look at each other, no idea what the other was thinking, but they all firmly believed that they would be different from their predecessors. The rain fell from the eaves and splashed on the broken stone steps. Before the splashes could bloom, they were swallowed up by more rain. There was a bonfire burning in the temple. After the wooden statue was chopped into firewood, the smell was rather strong. Qin Changsheng squatted beside the bonfire and incessantly pulled out the wet firewood from within. At the same time, he used the candlestick to flip the few pieces of rhizomes within the fire. Su Yurong leaned against the haystack. Her face was pale, and she looked very weak. With her injuries and loss of true blood, it was already a miracle that she was able to last until now and even win a few fierce battles. The roots of some unknown weed were roasted and emitted a faint aroma. Qin Changsheng picked it up from the ashes, tore off the outer layer, and walked in front of her. Su Yurong took it, tore it apart with her hands, and slowly ate it. Qin Changsheng quietly looked at her. Even now, he still did not know how she had saved him that night, because she had never mentioned it. However, along the way, he had personally witnessed her indescribably powerful strength. He had always thought that if he had not been there, she would have been able to leave safely from the very beginning. Su Yurong indeed didn't talk about it, because she had her own pride. She also thought that this youngster from the Snow Mountain sect also saved her, so they didn't owe each other anything. Not long after, she finished eating. Qin Changsheng handed over the wet handkerchief and began to eat by himself. Su Yurong took the wet handkerchief and lightly wiped the corner of her mouth. She quietly looked at him sitting beside the bonfire and didn't say anything. On the journey, due to various reasons, they didn't talk much, but they did many things for each other. To live and die together, to never leave or abandon each other. These are the most dazzling and intertwined words in the world, yet they were easily and casually accomplished by him and her. May the holy light be with you. Looking at his clear eyes that could reflect the bonfire, she said in her heart. Then she said to him, "You are a good person." She said these words very indifferently, but also very seriously. Chun Chong Sheng smiled at her and said, "You are the same." Then he suddenly thought of something and said with some embarrassment, "I'm very sorry that I didn't ask you until now. May I ask how I should address you?" Su Yurong smiled and said, "In you." It really was very interesting. Even now, the two of them didn't know each other's names or who they were. The rain continued to fall, and it was unknown when it would stop. The stars could not be seen in the Garden of Zhou. Yet looking in her eyes, Chun Chong Sheng seemed to see the night sky of Xining village after the rain stopped. There was not a trace of fog, not a speck of dust, and because of the countless stars in the night sky, it was incomparably bright. It was so bright that it made one flustered, so much so that it was impossible to lie to those eyes. Su Yurong also looked into his eyes. Those eyes were very clean and bright, and she could clearly see herself in them. Facing such a pair of eyes, it seemed like she could only answer honestly. The eyes are the windows to the soul. This was a famous saying, because it had appeared far too many times in the world. As a result, as long as it was not a child who had just started learning, no one would be willing to say it. Most of the time, no one would think of it. But now, as they looked into each other's eyes, they both thought of this saying. The feeling of being surrounded by the crowd in Wenshui City was not good. Now that she knew that she was Chun Chong Sheng, she probably would not be as indifferent and casual as she had been on this journey. From a very young age, she had lived a life of being the center of attention. Whether it was in the capital or in the south, she had always been the focus of everyone's gazes, the object of everyone's admiration. She did not like this kind of life, nor did she hope that after the other person knew that she was Su Yurong, his eyes would suddenly burn with passion, but his words and actions would become reserved and tasteless. But when they looked into each other's eyes, they decided to reveal their true identities, because this represented respect. However, just when their lips moved and their names were about to leave their mouths, they once again changed their minds, because they both had an engagement that the entire world knew of. If this white-clothed elf girl knew that she was Chun Chong Sheng, then she would know that she had a fiancé called Su Yurong. If this disciple of the Snow Mountain secret sect knew that she was Su Yurong, then she would know that she had a fiancé called Chun Chong Sheng. Neither of them liked that engagement. Both of them wanted to break it off, but he did not want her to know of this matter, and she did not want him to know of this matter. This sort of emotion was very complex, but this sort of thinking was very simple. Because no matter how extraordinary she was still a youth, still a girl. So, they made the same decision. Even many years later, the events that occurred in this rundown temple in the rain still remained unanswered. No one knew for what reason they had made this sort of decision, and even they themselves had not told each other what they were thinking at the time. Su Yurong's smile gradually faded, becoming very calm. Chun Chong Sheng's smile gradually grew calm, not wanting to reveal any flaws. Their voices rang out at the same time. Snow Mountain Sect, Su Sheng. Elf Race, Chun Chujian. The temple was very quiet at night. Only the sound of the falling rain could be heard. It was not irritating, but rather added to the tranquility. Before waking up in the cave, Chun Chong Sheng had faintly heard the voice of that old freak. He knew that, because of the black dragon, the other had mistaken him for a disciple of the Snow Mountain sect's secret sect, and also knew that the girl was an elf. He did not want to admit his identity, so he went with the flow. But how could he have known that Su Yurong had the same thoughts? Her voice was very soft, the tip of her tongue slightly curled up, and the end of her voice was lightly dragged out. Even though she was saying her own name, it still seemed rather jerky, but when it fell into his ears, he felt that it was very pleasant to hear. Her voice was pleasant to hear, her name was also pleasant to hear, her surname Chun was very good, and her name Chujian was also very good. What was that saying? If only life was as beautiful as it was at first sight. He looked at her slightly swollen, but still elegant, face, and thought of a few days ago by the pile of grass, her adorable appearance as she covered her cheeks. He thought to himself, if only life could be like this girl called Chu Jian, then it really wouldn't be too bad. Su Yurong's thoughts were even simpler. She knew that this youth was originally also surnamed Su. When she first saw him in his unconscious state, she had felt that he was somewhat familiar and wanted to get close to him. Could this be the reason? After exchanging names, what should they do next? The Rain Temple became quiet once more. Let's play a game? Su Yurong took out a chessboard from somewhere and invited him. He looked at the chessboard and knew that she was just like him, still hiding many secrets. He could not help but smile. Su Yurong also smiled without saying anything. They both knew that the other was not normal, but there was no need to talk about those uninteresting and tasteless things. If they could not walk out of this garden of Zhou, then what was the point of those worldly matters? Yes, outside of life and death, besides enjoying life, nothing else was important, but the important thing was, I don't know how to play chess. He said somewhat shamefully. Seeing her slightly disappointed expression, he added, or maybe we can play something else? Su Yurong thought to herself, if they wanted to play dominoes, they were still lacking 2 people. If they wanted to play Yangzhou cards, they were lacking even more people. With only 2 people, if they did not play chess, then what could they do? The night was long, and the cold rain was dreary. It was not a good time to sleep, not to mention that she had already slept for a long time on this journey. Then they could only chat, and it would not exhaust their mental and physical strength. However, they were currently on the run, not on a blind date. As a result, they naturally would not talk about anything too in-depth. For example, how many people did your family have? How are your parents? How are you 20 this year? Why are your eyes so beautiful? Do you still have the blood of the Black Frost Dragon in your body? Have you ever been married? This was the first time they had truly chatted. They were cultivators, so they were not too familiar with each other, so they could only talk about cultivation. The cultivation here was true cultivation, and it had nothing to do with the sour words that life was just cultivation. The bonfire in the Rain Temple illuminated the faces of this young man and woman. At this moment, they had absolutely no idea what the other party meant to their lives. Wow, this is the end of the first half of the plot. The second half is about to begin. This entire plot is the part that I personally like the most, the part that I look forward to the most. It is not excessive to say that at least half of the first 800,000 characters were written to lay out this plot, so I wrote very slowly and very seriously. No matter what the final result is, I am very satisfied with myself. What comes next is not the first meeting, but the stage where they sincerely meet. Finally, I'll have to trouble you to vote for me. Thank you. Chapter 302. The atmosphere of this conversation that took place in the ruined temple on a rainy night was very good. Every Xiuzha on the long path of Xiuzha would encounter a few difficult questions, and these questions were closely related to their own situation. Even their teachers would find it hard to give them an answer, often requiring a long period of time to think it through, and the difficulty of these questions, in a sense, represented the level of Xiuzha. In this conversation about Xiuxing, the questions that Chun Changsheng asked were all very difficult and of high level. Su Yurong listened quietly most of the time and would only say a few words occasionally. However, those few words were always like a bonfire in the dark night, very eye-catching and illuminating the world in front of him, allowing him to see a brand new path. This made him very surprised, and then very impressed. This young girl's knowledge and attainment in Xiuzhou was unimaginably high. Tang 36 and Su Mo, you were also very talented in Xiuzhou, but compared to her, they were clearly lacking by a large margin. Among those of the same age that he had met, only Gohan Shi could compare to her. And of course, there was also his senior Yurun who didn't seem to know how to Xiuzhou. Due to the level of these Xiuzhou questions and their strange way of thinking, Su Yurong also felt a lot of admiration for him, thinking that among the Xiuzhou of the younger generation that she had met, besides Senior Qiushan and Gohan Shi, there was actually no one who could compare to him. It must be known that although Snow Mountain Sect had a history of 10,000 years, had a deep foundation, and was once endlessly glorious, it was still located in the northwest. Unlike the academies in the capital, the Longevity Sect, or the Holy Maiden Peak, where they could come into contact with the newest knowledge of the Xiuzhou world. For him to actually have such knowledge and ability, it could only be said that he was a genius. The cold rain outside the temple grew heavier and heavier. The voices of the conversation became quieter and quieter, and the hay became warmer and warmer. The two of them sat with a distance of 1 foot apart, leaning against the wall, conversing softly. Occasionally, they would silently ponder for a moment, their eyebrows slightly furrowed, illuminated by the firelight into an interesting shape. Then he would suggest a certain conjecture, and she would suggest another possibility. To be able to become the youngest cultivator at the upper level of ethereal opening in history in a short span of a year, apart from the fact that his teacher and senior had given him an exceedingly solid foundation, Chun Changsheng was obviously also a cultivation genius. It must be known that it was absolutely impossible to obtain first place upon the first banner in the grand examination by solely relying on reading books and reading the scripture of the way, and even more so, not being able to comprehend all of the front mausoleum's monoliths in a single night. As for Su Yurong, it went without saying that she was a cultivation genius. It had to be known that if one were to carefully calculate, the youngest upper-level ethereal opening cultivator in history might not necessarily be Chun Changsheng, but rather her, because she was younger than Chun Changsheng by 3 days. At this moment, they didn't know each other's true identity, but they were already becoming more and more certain that she was a cultivation genius, and geniuses were often lonely because they lacked an equal person to communicate with in the spiritual world. This saying seemed rather cliché, but it was very true. All geniuses hope to be able to meet a companion, to meet someone who could easily understand what they were talking about, to be able to discuss matters with that person that they normally wouldn't have a chance to discuss. This was akin to having an itch on your back that you hadn't been able to scratch for many years, and suddenly having someone reach out and scratch it for you. This was the itch being scratched. How could it not be comfortable? This conversation progressed more and more pleasantly, and even the calm and composed Su Yurong's eyes grew brighter and brighter. Until late in the night, Chun Changsheng brought up a somewhat rebellious idea, asking if the space between the spleens could be used to replace the function of the air meridian. This caused Su Yurong to contemplate for a very long time, and just as she was thinking of a certain possibility, she suddenly felt a slight weight on her shoulder before smelling a very faint scent. Looking at Chun Changsheng, who was leaning on her shoulder and sleeping soundly, she was startled for a moment, and a hint of shyness and annoyance appeared in her eyes. She didn't like being approached by men, let alone in such an intimate position. On this journey, she was carried by Chun Changsheng, which already made her feel extremely burdened, not to mention that he was now leaning on her shoulder. She extended her finger and slowly placed it between Chun Changsheng's eyebrows, preparing to push him away, but for some reason, she didn't use any strength. A thunderous, snoring sound echoed throughout the old temple, even suppressing the sound of the rain outside. Su Yurong looked at the sleeping Chun Changsheng and remembered that on this journey, he was extremely sleepy. As long as he had time, he would basically close his eyes and sleep, which should be the side effect of the Snow Mountain Sex cultivation method. Tonight was probably no exception. Previously, he should have been extremely sleepy, but he kept talking to her, which made her feel a little warm. At the same time, she still felt a little embarrassed. This was the first time she was so close to a man. Of course, she had already been on his back for many days, but that was because she had no choice. That was because of her injuries. That was because of her rights. In short, she had countless ways to comfort herself and find excuses, but right now, she couldn't find an excuse. He just leaned on her shoulder. His brows and eyes were right in front of her, incomparably clear. The sisters-in-law in the small town always said stinky men, but he wasn't really stinky. He didn't have any smell. All right, seeing that you are heavily injured, and I'm also heavily injured, I can't move. I'll let you go. Su Yurong thought like this and retracted her finger. Then she closed her eyes, preparing to sleep with the night rain, but until a long time ago, her eyelashes were still lightly trembling. She didn't know if it was because his snoring was too loud or if it was because of something else. What a pair of adulterers. The rain stopped at some point, and Nank's cold voice rang out from outside the old temple. With the sound of footsteps, she, the zither-playing old man, the two maids, and the demon general couple walked into the temple. Her gaze moved from the already extinguished fire to the pile of grass by the wall. Looking at the messy grass and the marks left by their bodies being crushed, she very easily deduced that last night, Su Yu Rong and Shin Changsheng should have fallen asleep in each other's arms. The two maids knew that ever since she was a child, she strictly abided by etiquette and rules. She considered herself a virtuous gentleman, placing more importance on virtue than anything else, so they did not find her current reaction strange. The demon general couple could not help but be somewhat shocked, and then they found it rather funny. Lu Wana laughed. They have an engagement, so how can it be called adulterers? This demon general couple was powerful, and they were not her subordinates, so she could not reprimand them like she would her maids. However, she still forced herself to say, men and women should not touch. Even if they are engaged, as long as they are not married, they should maintain a distance. On this journey, she had him carry her. It can be said that she had no choice, so what does that count as? Lu Wana laughed and did not say anything else. Since Su Yu Rong and Qin Changsheng had already left, the group of demon elites naturally did not linger. They left the temple. On both sides of the white grass path, the grassland was filled with the presence of monsters. Some of the monsters were so powerful that even the demon general couple felt a little afraid. Although the zither-playing old man said that he could use the sound of his zither to control some low-level monsters, he definitely did not have the ability to control such powerful monsters. Moreover, his zither was currently on his back and did not make any sound. However, for some reason, not only did the powerful monsters not attack them, they even faintly displayed a feeling of submission. This was because Nank held a piece of blackwood in her hand. It was unknown what this piece of blackwood was, but it constantly emitted some sort of signal to the surrounding grassland. The zither-playing old man's gaze fell on the piece of blackwood. He thought back to the shock he felt when he saw Nank take out the blackwood for the first time a few days ago. This piece of blackwood, which did not seem to have any mystical properties, was actually able to make the monsters of the plains of the unsetting sun obey its orders. Even the most powerful, and at the same time the most arrogant and ruthless monsters, after their initial uneasiness, very quickly expressed their submission. It was very obvious that this piece of blackwood was the most powerful method that military advisor Blackrobe had left for Nank. Nank did not think that this piece of blackwood would have such unimaginable power. Lord Blackrobe became more and more mysterious and mighty in the hearts of these demon experts. Just who was he? How could he have such a deep understanding of the Garden of Zhou, and even possess a magical artifact that clearly belonged to the Garden of Zhou? This was something they could not understand, nor could they ask about. What the zither-playing old man did not understand was why Nank did not use this piece of blackwood to order the innumerable monsters of the grassland to directly tear Su Yu Rong and Chun Changsheng to pieces. Instead, she ordered the monsters not to attack without permission. Just what was she trying to do? Teacher handed this piece of blackwood to me. He must have calculated that I might walk into this grassland, but teacher did not tell me the origins of this piece of blackwood. This means that teacher left the final choice to me. I can use the blackwood to kill them, but I can also pursue an even greater dream. Nank looked into the distance of the white grass path. She did not see the figures of those two, but it was as if she had seen them. With an indifferent expression, she said, although I don't understand how they did it, it's very clear that they know where Zhou Dufu's grave is, and they know the location of the sword pool. So, of course, they can't die. The zither-playing old man said in a low voice, but now that we've already found the white grass path, why do we still need to keep them alive? Nank said, if not for them, we would never have been able to find this white grass path in this vast grassland. Similarly, I cannot be sure what kind of test we still need to pass to enter Zhou Dufu's mausoleum. I will never use something that I have no confidence in to gamble something that the other party already possesses. The zither-playing old man understood. He said no more and respectfully retreated to the side. Tung Xiaoming walked to the side of the path and squatted down. He carefully observed the traces left behind by Su Yurong and Chun Changsheng. He felt a great deal of respect towards Su Yurong and Chun Changsheng. He thought to himself that they truly deserve to be called the most outstanding male and female of the younger generation of the human world, to be able to persist until now. Nank raised her head to confirm the position of the sun in the sky after the rain. She continued forward, her leather boots crushing the frost-like white grass, leaving behind a clear footprint. The Zither playing Old Man, the two demon beauties, as well as Tung Xiaoming and Lu Wan'er, followed behind. Even further behind, in the even vaster grassland, countless monsters, like a tide, overflowed the pools of water and wasteland, silently following. It was a spectacular and terrifying scene. I've seen the reader say that he's in a bad mood and wants me to be willful and write a few more chapters. But dear, I want to be willful, but I'm still lacking 50,000 words for this month's mission. I'm really not writing fast. The next chapter will be released around 7 o'clock. Also, I often mix up Lu Wan'er and Lu Wan. Everyone, keep your eyes half closed and pretend you didn't see it. Chapter 303. Qin Changsheng and Su Yurong were also on the white grass path. Along the way, whether it was raining or sunny, the yellow paper umbrella was always open. By now, Su Yurong had roughly guessed that the reason he was able to confirm the location of a sword pool and lead her on this path to the Star Sea Tomb was probably related to this umbrella. When snowflakes suddenly fell from the sky, this shabby-looking umbrella displayed its original function. Silently, the extremely thick snowflakes fell on the surface of the umbrella, gradually accumulating thicker and thicker. It was even more so on the white grass path. The accumulated snow gradually reached their ankles, and it was difficult to see the waist of the grass branches. Chun Changsheng and Su Yurong felt a bit strange. Previously, it was a beautiful scene of spring. Why did it suddenly start snowing? The grassland in front of them turned white at a speed visible to the naked eye. Only then did they realize that the grass near the road had long withered, and the pools of water between the grass had frozen solid. The snow was mixed with a cold wind. The yellow paper umbrella could bear the snow, but it could not block out all the wind. The temperature suddenly dropped, and a chill enveloped the surroundings. Su Yurong had lost too much blood. She couldn't bear the cold at all. Her body trembled slightly. Chun Changsheng felt it and didn't dare to continue forward. After putting her down, he took off his clothes and helped her put them on. Then, he tightened the cuffs of his sleeves and the hem of his clothes. Looking at the unlined robe he was wearing, Su Yurong was somewhat worried. She was about to reject his good intentions, but then she remembered that he was a disciple of the Snow Mountain Sect's hidden sect and cultivated the most authentic black frost-cold will. She did not thank him. If she wanted to thank him, the two of them did not need to say anything else on this journey. She said softly, "May the holy light be with you." Chun Changsheng didn't hear it clearly and asked, "What did you say?" Su Yurong said, "Nothing. How far is it to the second temple?" Chun Changsheng calculated the time and said, "If we erase the difference in the flow of time, it should be soon." Indeed, very soon, they saw the second temple in the snow. At the same time, they knew that they were 900 miles away from Zhou Dufu's mausoleum. The sacrificial temple in the wind and snow was extremely shabby and cold. There was white snow everywhere, from the eaves to the stone steps in front of the temple. Therefore, the large pool of blood on the stone steps was a little shocking. Su Yurong leaned against a pillar and sat quietly with her head lowered. Her face was pale, and she looked extremely weak. Chun Changsheng looked at her and remained silent for a long time before saying, "In the future, don't be like this." Just as they walked into the wind-snow temple, a ferret drilled out from a pile of snow beside the temple and bit towards Chun Changsheng's neck. The name Snow Ferret sounded very ordinary, but if it was placed in the world outside the Garden of Zhou, it would be a name that would cause even ethereal opening cultivators to feel fear. This kind of monster had an extremely high intelligence and was extremely crafty. Moreover, it had a patience that was not inferior to the wolf tribe. The most frightening thing was that its body contained a deadly poison. Just a single drop was enough to kill several hundred humans. What was somewhat difficult to understand was that although Chun Chong Sheng and Su Yurong had not recovered from their heavy injuries, the chi they emitted should have allowed this extremely intelligent monster to understand that they were not ordinary ethereal opening cultivators. Not to mention that Nank had already used that piece of black wood to convey her will to the entire plains of the unsetting sun. However, this snow ferret still unhesitatingly launched an attack towards them, as if their flesh and blood, to it, possessed an irresistible allure. Just as this snow ferret swept up the wind and snow and suddenly appeared, Su Yurong, who had been lying on Chun Chongsheng's back and seemed to be in a deep sleep, suddenly opened her eyes and extended her hand, turning the snow ferret into a wisp of green smoke. For this, the true essence that she had accumulated with great difficulty was once again used up. "Don't be like this in the future?" she asked Chun Chongsheng. As Chun Chongsheng fiddled with the fire, he thought about how to phrase his words. He said, "Don't be so stubborn." Su Yurong said, "You think I'm stubborn?" Chun Chongsheng looked at the gradually growing flame and heard that there was something wrong with her mood. He didn't directly answer the question and said, "In short, don't be like this in the future." Previously, in the instant that the snow ferret had attacked, he had already drawn his dagger, but he hadn't been as fast as Su Yurong. Su Yurong didn't say anything else. The reason why she didn't hesitate to expend her true essence and attack first was because she felt that this was her responsibility. It was obvious that the snow ferret had smelled the remnant scent of the heavenly phoenix's true blood in her body, which was why it had gone berserk. Chun Chongsheng also didn't say anything else. The reason why he said these words to her was because he felt somewhat guilty. He felt that this was his responsibility. It was obvious that the snow ferret had smelled the scent of his blood, which was why it had gone berserk. The burning pile of firewood let out crackling sounds. This temple was even more dilapidated than the previous one. The divine statues that Chun Chongsheng had chopped into firewood were covered with snow and were somewhat wet. The temple was silent. For some reason, the two of them were silent for a very long time. Suddenly, Su Yurong stared at him and said, "You feel that I'm trying to be brave?" Chun Chongsheng still didn't raise his head and said, "If you feel that this word isn't pleasant, I can change it." Su Yurong was silent for a while and said, "It doesn't matter. I've heard this word countless times since I was young. I'm already used to it." Chun Chongsheng handed over the roasted snow ferret meat to her, looked at her pale face, and said, "If you're tired, close your eyes and rest for a while." Su Yurong took the ferret meat, but didn't eat it immediately. The word tired and trying to be brave made her think of many things. In such a weak state, those memories weren't very pleasant and made her feel very tired. From a very young age, when the heavenly phoenix's blood had awakened, she had carried the hopes of countless people. Family, country, and clan were all on her shoulders. How could she not be tired, but how could she let it go? She placed the ferret meat on the grass in front of her, lowered her head, and said softly, "There are some things that can't be let go, so even if it's trying to be brave, you have to continue doing it." Seeing her appearance, Chun Chongsheng felt a great deal of pity. This girl's talent in cultivation was extremely high. Presumably, she carried the hopes of the entire elf race. However, the elf race had suffered so many hardships in these past 1,000 years, nearly being exterminated several times. Now that their homeland had been occupied by the demons and the many powerful powers of the continent were watching coldly from the sidelines, it was easier said than done for the elf race to revive. She had to carry the entire tribe forward. How difficult would that be? He comforted her. With great power comes great responsibility. There are some things that really can't be let go just because you want to. In truth, he had also lived this kind of life. This was the shadow of death, heavier than any pressure. Moreover, it had nothing to do with power, only with fate. Su Yurong was silent for a very long time, then said, "But in reality, I only know how to cultivate. Other things are not my forte, nor are they what I want. Every time I think of the fervent hopes of my elders, every time I think of those extremely complicated matters, not only do I not have the slightest confidence, I instead truly feel my own uselessness and cowardice, even gradually feeling inferior." She had never said these words to anyone, not to the divine empress or her holy maiden teacher, not to those youths close to her in the Mountly Sword sect, not to those junior sisters in the outer sect of South Stream Temple, not to mention her schoolmates in the 13 divisions of Radiant Green, not to mention her parents in the capital's divine general of the East Estate. But now, she had said them to Chen Changsheng. If she had not been so weak from her heavy injuries, if she had not been in this grassland that no one could walk out of, if she had not been so close to death, given her pride and powerful spirit, she would never have said these words. As she spoke, she felt a faint sense of regret, but the words had already left her mouth, so she could no longer pay attention to them. Chen Changsheng thought to himself, those elders of the elf race might be raising you as the next tribe leader, so they naturally need you to familiarize yourself with the affairs of the race. It's just that you're so intelligent, and your talent and cultivation is so astonishing. So presumably, you're extremely capable. Why would you feel inferior because of these things? Seeing his expression, Su Yu Rong asked in confusion, could it be that you've never felt inferior because of something? In any case, he had already begun to say it, and he didn't know who she was, thinking that she was the elf race's Lady Chujian. So what harm was there in saying a few more words? Chen Changsheng very seriously thought about it, wanting to find a similar feeling in the past 15 years, but he could not find it. He really had never felt inferior. Even when he thought about the humiliation he had suffered in the divine general of the East Estate when he was preparing to break off the engagement, he only felt some helplessness and anger. I didn't think that you were such a narcissistic person. Su Yurong looked at him and smiled. But do you really think that you're so perfect? Chen Changsheng thought to himself that Tang 36 was the narcissistic person. There is no one in this world who is perfect in every aspect. As he said this, he suddenly thought of a person that he had never met, but had heard of countless names. Qiu Shanjun. He shook his head, throwing that name out of his mind, and continued, but not being perfect doesn't mean you have to feel inferior. Su Yurong couldn't understand and said, if no matter how hard you try, you still can't beat someone in some aspect, won't you feel ashamed? Chen Changsheng didn't understand and said, why should I feel ashamed? Su Yurong said, isn't that shameless? Chen Changsheng was a little surprised. He didn't think that this girl was such a person. He asked, are you sick? The crackling sound in the firewood was already gone. The temple was very quiet. Only the sound of wind and snow and Su Yurong's gradually heavier breathing could be heard. She was a little angry. She had enough reason to be angry. From childhood to adulthood, from the capital to the Holy Maiden Peak, no one had ever dared to speak loudly to her, let alone use such serious words to lecture her. Even the Divine Queen and the Holy Maiden Master didn't act like this. Because she had always walked on the path of perfection, she had extremely strict requirements for herself, and there was nothing that could be criticized. Until today, in this snowy old temple, this young man said, are you crazy? She even suspected that she heard wrong, but she knew that she didn't. So she looked at Chen Changsheng, forced herself to be calm, and asked, do you want to die? Chapter 304. Su Yurong's blood and qi were all used up. She was very weak. She couldn't even walk, let alone fight. Therefore, her do you want to die didn't have that arrogant, noble, and domineering feeling. Of course, in Chen Changsheng's eyes, this ridiculousness was more like cuteness. He smiled and said, if you weren't sick, why would you have such an absurd idea? Su Yurong tried to control her emotions and said, how is this idea absurd? Chen Changsheng said, I said before, there is no perfect person in this world. If you can't be perfect, if you're a little worse than others, you should feel ashamed. Isn't this absurd? The Pope's potted plants aren't as good as the gardeners in the herb garden, so he should feel ashamed? The Divine Queen's needlework isn't as good as the needlework of the workers in Wenshui City, so she should feel ashamed? Su Yurong slightly raised her eyebrows and said, I'm talking about an attitude towards life. Only by living with this attitude can you become more perfect. Chen Changsheng shook his head and said, I'm not saying that this attitude isn't desirable, but have you ever thought that if it's attitude that matters, then as long as we keep working hard until the last moment of our lives, we can't say that we don't have the possibility of being perfect. Since the winner hasn't been decided, why should we feel ashamed? As for feeling inferior, that's even more impossible. He took out a freshly cooked root from the fire and gave it to her. He exchanged the slightly cold root from her hand and continued, "If you can't do it now, it doesn't mean you can't do it in the future. Even if you can't do it in the future, so what? Working hard should come from the heart and not from the psychological gap caused by comparing with others. As long as you really work hard, then it's enough." Su Yurong was silent. No one knew what she was thinking. Chun Chong Sheng said again, "I think you should think clearly. Other people's hopes, for us, aren't important. What we want to do is truly important. Shouldn't people live for themselves?" Su Yurong raised her head and looked at him. Chun Chong Sheng understood her meaning and said, "Of course we have to take responsibility, but we should still live for ourselves. Moreover, the latter should be above the former." Su Yurong thought about it and said, "I don't understand." Chun Chong Sheng thought for a moment, then smiled and said, "I'm just saying." After this conversation, he realized that the girl was like a hedgehog in the forest, always on guard against something. It was easy for her to hurt the flowers and plants around her and the kind hands that carried kindness, but it was also easy for her to hurt herself. Perhaps it was because of this that she was so sensitive and delicate under her calm, indifferent, and powerful appearance. When he mentioned perfection earlier, he was just playing along with her words. In reality, he had never thought about it. He felt that her way of thinking was very strange, which is why he thought that she was sick. Which ordinary person would set perfection as their goal in life? Once they realized that they couldn't achieve absolute perfection, they would start to self-doubt and belittle themselves. What you said sounds reasonable, and it might make life a little easier, but if Su Yurong hesitated for a moment and asked, "The education I received since I was young makes me unable to accept your point of view. Then how should I face this kind of pressure?" Chun Chong Sheng pointed at the root in her hand and said, "Eat it while it's hot. Let's just chat." Su Yurong followed his words and tore open the slightly burnt skin of the root. Along with a stream of hot steam, a light fragrance also floated out. Chun Chong Sheng said, "First, we need to know what we want to do the most and what is the goal of life." Seeing her expression, he quickly said, "Don't say the word perfection anymore. Perfection is used to describe the degree, not the specific reality." Su Yurong thought about it and said, "The thing I want to do the most is cultivate." "Then cultivate," he said. Su Yurong was a little unhappy, thinking that he was just fooling around. Chun Chong Sheng explained, "Except for cultivating, you don't need to think about anything else." Su Yurong said, "But those things still exist." Chun Chong Sheng said, "When I close my eyes, the sky is dark. If I don't look at the world doesn't exist." Su Yurong said, "How can you convince yourself with idealistic words? Also, cultivating is only a method, not the goal." Chun Chong Sheng looked at her and recalled everything he saw and heard on the way here. He said, "If I'm not wrong, your goal of cultivating should be to become stronger?" Su Yurong said, "Only when I'm strong enough can I bear the responsibility that I should bear." Chun Chong Sheng said helplessly, "Can we first forget about the word responsibility?" Su Yurong said seriously, "I don't dare to forget about it." Chun Chong Sheng thought about it seriously and said, "Then I suggest that before you become the strongest person, temporarily forget about this goal and put all of your energy into cultivating the Tao." Su Yurong said, "Without a goal, how can I walk steadily?" Chun Chong Sheng said, "That means your goal isn't firm enough and can't be shaken. If the goal has already entered into your consciousness and blood, why do you need to constantly remind yourself?" Su Yurong thought about it and said, "That makes sense. Then what's your goal of cultivating? Have you already forgotten?" "Of course I haven't forgotten." Chun Chong Sheng was quiet for a while and said, "What I want is immortality." He cultivated to follow his heart and sought the way of immortality. "What's the benefit of doing this?" Su Yurong asked. Chun Chong Sheng understood that she was asking about the benefit of having one's heart and forgetting one's thoughts, not the benefit of seeking the way of immortality. Regarding this method, only he could understand the benefit of it the best in this world, because the goal he wanted to pursue was itself a great pressure. The shadow of death had always shrouded the end of his path of Xiaoxing, waiting for him and getting closer and closer. If he didn't learn to forget this, he probably would have already become crazy under this terrifying pressure. Why did he always cultivate to follow his heart from the old temple in Xining village? Because if his heart didn't follow his heart, he wouldn't be able to live normally. How could his heart follow his heart under this terrifying pressure? He could only forget but remember his initial thought and live like that. Only by doing so could he be peaceful and happy. His voice kept ringing. It was very calm, and the speed of his speech was not fast, but the meaning was very clear. No matter how violent the snowstorm outside the temple was, it couldn't suppress it. The door of the ruined temple was broken long ago. Cold wind mixed with snowflakes floated in. Most of it was blocked by the bonfire, but some fell on his face, just like the firelight fell on his face. The cold wind and the warm firelight blended together and became a cool breeze. Su Yurong listened very seriously. Looking at his face, her eyes became brighter and brighter. This young man seemed to have seen everything in the world, but he didn't look old and heavy. He was still full of energy, just like a cool breeze, making people feel very comfortable. I don't know how to write this chapter. For a normal person like me to write about the conversation between geniuses, it's pure nonsense. So I didn't write the details later. Anyway, they were discussing Tao and preparing to have a heart-to-heart talk. After this chapter, the next chapter will still be released after 7 o'clock. I will try to update it regularly. Yes, I have a draft, although it's only one chapter. Chapter 305. Su Yurong didn't understand. She thought, "You are most 20 years old, not much older than me. How can you understand life so clearly? And to be able to use such simple words to clearly explain such complicated principles. How did the Snow Mountain sect teach you? How do you usually live?" She said, "I have never seen a person as eloquent as you." Chun Chong Sheng was a little surprised. He never thought he would receive such an evaluation. Ever since he was young, he lived with Senior Yurin. He rarely spoke and spent most of his time gesturing with his hands. After coming to the capital, many people thought he was a little taciturn. Then when did he start to talk so much? Was it because he had to teach Luo and Xian Yuanpa in the Tradition Academy? Or was it because in this year, Tang 36, that troublesome rich kid, nagged beside his ear every day? Or did it have something to do with who he was talking to? Looking at the young girl's elegant face illuminated by the fire, he felt a little flustered for no reason. Then he said, "I'm just talking nonsense." Su Yurong looked at him and asked seriously, "Why do you understand these principles?" Chun Chong Sheng thought, "That's because you lived in the plains, isolated from the world. No one could communicate with you." Su Yurong said, "To be able to see responsibilities, pressure, and life so clearly, you can't do it without self-reflection day and night. You are really amazing." Chun Chong Sheng said honestly, "I really didn't think that much. It's just that things like pressure can easily bring about negative emotions. It's not good for health, so I don't like it." After the wind and snow stopped, the two left the temple and continued on their way. Suddenly, they walked into a torrential downpour. Without waiting for them to think of a way to avoid the rain stopped. The sun once again shined on the plains. The rain instantly evaporated. It was hot. It was as if it was summer. Going forward, the grass was slightly yellow with white frost. The white grass path gradually melted into the plains. It was bleak. It was as if autumn had arrived. The plains in the Garden of Zhou were indeed very mysterious. It was unknown whether it was because of the distortion of space or the speed of time, but the seasons changed very quickly, often giving people a feeling of being unprepared. At its most exaggerated point, in a short distance of 10 miles, they went from spring to summer, then from autumn to winter. Although the environment was harsh, it could be solved after all. What comforted them the most, and at the same time made them even more nervous, was that they didn't encounter any more demonic beasts. Running out of the summer that was covered by rain and clouds, Chen Changsheng placed Su Yurong in a field of blooming spring flowers. He then took out a large piece of pure white snow that he had prepared in winter and the utensils he had taken from the first two temples. He began to melt the snow and boil the water. At the same time, he began to pluck the feathers of the autumn goose that he had caught in the early morning and cut open its belly, preparing to make a pot of goose stew with water chestnuts. The aroma of food gradually filled the air, but the grassland beside the road was silent. This strange silence used to make them very vigilant, but now they had learned to ignore it. He was more worried about the problem of time. According to the scale on the flowing water bottle, they had already entered the Garden of Zhou for over 20 days. Every time the Garden of Zhou opened, it would only open for 100 days. Once the garden closed, the laws of the miniature world within would be reversed. The demonic beasts and fish that lived within would not be a problem, but cultivators with a sea of consciousness would be struck to death by heavenly lightning. He didn't know what the current situation was in the world outside the Garden of Zhou. Logically, since the gate to the garden was closed, it would definitely attract the attention of those outside the garden. His Eminence, Archbishop Mei Shah, and drinking alone under the moonlight should have responded, but he didn't know if there was a way to open the gate. Furthermore, the several hundred human cultivators in the Garden of Zhou had already gathered in one place. Would they leave the garden and search for their companions that were alone in the wilderness? Of course, he didn't have too much confidence in the latter. As we go deeper into the plains, time slows down. Right now, where we are, one day is roughly equivalent to 15 minutes outside. So for now, we don't have to worry about the Garden of Zhou closing. In the past few days, when Su Yurong was awake, she had constantly used the fated star plate to calculate. Through the minute differences between the two flowing water bottles and the speed of the sun that seemed to be on the verge of setting, but was unwilling to set, she had obtained a relatively accurate result. As she said these words, she was on Chen Changsheng's back, holding the flowing water bottle and looking at it. She only had one hand to support his shoulder, so naturally, she was completely lying on his back. By now, the two of them had already become much more familiar with each other, and their interactions had also become much more casual. Her actions of carrying him were already very natural, unlike at the very beginning, when even if she was weak to the point of not being able to support herself, she would still support his shoulder with both hands, allowing her body to maintain a slight distance from his back. It was very strenuous. Chen Changsheng was also no longer as cautious as he was at the beginning. It was extremely likely that he would use the most comfortable position to hold her leg, and no longer had to worry about whether or not it was a bit too much. At the same time, her casualness made him feel even more comforted. He could feel the soft body of a young girl, and on this long and seemingly endless journey, it had greatly increased his strength. The feeling that came from behind him was truly very soft. He was embarrassed to imagine her body, but he very naturally came to the conclusion that it was just as the rumors said. Young girls of the elf race were indeed very enchanting. Thinking about how the young girl was still heavily injured, and yet he was still thinking about these things, he felt somewhat ashamed. Perhaps in order to dispel this kind of emotion, he said, "In the future, can I call you Soft?" This was still a conversation that had nothing to say, and it was a classic example of the stupidest and worst kind. As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt some regret. On this journey, he had clearly understood that she was a cold girl with a rather dignified air. She definitely wouldn't like this sort of teasing. Su Yurong obviously didn't like it. If this was any other time, she would definitely be extremely angry and then beat Chen Changsheng to the point that even Luo wouldn't be able to recognize him. But for some reason, at this moment, her face was filled with embarrassment and anger, but she didn't say anything, nor did she do anything. Amidst the spring flowers, summer rain, autumn fruits, and winter snow, they walked through the 4 seasons and continued forward. Occasionally, they would rest, fight monsters, cook, and calm their minds. Then, they would always find an old temple. They became more and more familiar with each other. Even when they didn't speak and just quietly looked at each other, they no longer felt awkward. Sometimes, He would even make a funny face to make her smile when she was weak. Of course, when they were resting and waiting for the meat to be cooked, they would often talk, and it was often Su Yurong who asked him to say something. Since she was very young, she had become the most famous person in this continent. She was the center of attention and was accompanied by countless elites whenever she went out, but she was lonely. In Xining village, he only had his senior as a companion. After coming to the capital, he had also gotten used to the quietness of the Tradition Academy, but he was never lonely. He could feel her loneliness, so whenever she wanted to hear something, he would start talking. He would ramble on about some random small things, such as what kind of fish was delicious and not poisonous. When the stream was the clearest, you could see the bottom of the pool dozens of feet deep, and that there was a kind of dolphin there. As long as the poisonous organs were removed, it would be the most delicious, and that the pine trees on the mountain really looked like monsters. Occasionally, she would also talk about which aunties in the small town liked to curse the most, and which restaurant had the best food. He did not really understand, but he guessed that it should be the place where she grew up. But because she was getting weaker and weaker, and because she felt that her 15 years of life in the eyes of others was incomparably dazzling compared to Chun Changsheng's life, she felt a little inferior and did not want to talk more. She was very grateful to Chun Changsheng for talking with such a boring person. One day, the wind and snow came again, and they rested in the 7th old temple by the white grass path. By the bonfire, Chun Changsheng ended his memories of his childhood. She looked at him and said sincerely, "You really are a good person." Chun Changsheng thought that this evaluation was not bad. She lightly blessed him, "May the holy light be with you." In the old temple in the rain, they started their first real conversation. Up until now, dozens of days had passed. "May the holy light be with you." She would say this blessing once every day. They got closer and closer to Zhou Du Fu's mausoleum, and she also became weaker and weaker. Relying on the black dragon's black frost chill, Chun Changsheng's injuries were slowly recovering, but her situation did not improve. The poison of the peacock plume continued to spread throughout her body and gradually began to wreak havoc. She had lost too much of the heavenly phoenix's true blood, and there was nothing she could do. Chun Changsheng had once ventured deep into the grasslands and killed many monsters, but now, the blood of those monsters, no matter if it was fire or cold, could not help her in the slightest. She wrapped herself in his outer clothes and quietly leaned against the pile of grass. She looked at the dancing flames in the pile of firewood and said no more. The snowy temple was silent, and even the wind had stopped. Looking at her pale face and her eyes that were gradually drying up, Chun Changsheng felt very sad. This was the sadness that had started early. He wanted to say something to break the stifling silence in the temple, but he did not know what to say. Seeing his lowered head, Su Yurong knew how he felt and calmly said, "It has nothing to do with you." Chun Changsheng raised his head, looked at her, and said, "Even now, you are not willing to talk about what happened on the first night, but I know that you definitely saved me, and you never abandoned me." Su Yurong calmly looked at him and said, "It's the same for you." Chun Changsheng said, "I suddenly understand what you said that night. If I was strong enough, as strong as you were before you were injured, when we faced those demon experts that day, I would still have been able to bring you away. I would not have been forced to flee into these grasslands and walk this dead end." Su Yurong said, "On the contrary, I feel that what you said that night was more reasonable. If I had not been so stubborn, perhaps I would not have been injured at all." These were her true thoughts. If, after discovering the traces of the demons in the Garden of Zhou, she had not chosen to walk that mountain path alone out of pride, but had chosen to join hands with other human cultivators, like the youth she was familiar with from the Mountly Sword sect, or that fellow called Chun Changsheng, none of this would have happened. The snowy temple became quiet once more, so quiet that it was unsettling. Chun Changsheng did not like this sort of silence. Thinking of her prayer from before, he asked, "Is this a habit of your people?" Su Yurong thought, in the end, the Snow Mountain sect is still a little too remote. He is incomparably familiar with the Taoist canon, yet he does not even know this. "Yes, I wish you a peaceful life." "Thank you. I also thank you." Su Yurong grew weaker by the day, but she had never forgotten to say those words. Those were her sincere blessings and hopes. She knew that it would probably be very difficult for her to leave these grasslands, so if there was still a chance of survival, she wanted to hand it all over to this kind-hearted disciple of the Snow Mountain sect. Just when it seemed like her 15 years of life had come to an end, the white grass path had come to an end ahead of time. Just when her eyes were about to close, she finally saw the mausoleum. She was on Chun Changsheng's back, so she was slightly taller than him, so she saw a moment before he did. From a distance, the mausoleum seemed more like a mountain. There were no cliffs on the mountain, and there were very few green trees. As a result, one could clearly see the straight lines from the top of the mausoleum to the foot of the mausoleum. Qin Changsheng found it rather familiar. As he walked closer to the mausoleum, he remembered that it was very similar to the mausoleum of books. After walking through the grasslands for several dozen days, they had finally found the legendary mausoleum of Zhou. How could they not be excited? It was just that he and Su Yurong were already very tired, so it was very difficult for them to express joy or nervousness. Continuing along the white grass path, the distance of over 10 li still took a very long time. Only then did the two finally arrive in front of the green mausoleum. From this, it could be calculated just how tall and how big the mausoleum was. As they got closer, the details of the mausoleum could be seen even more clearly. Its height also seemed more real, such as the divine path of several thousand zhang that led directly to the center of the mausoleum wall, or the huge square stones that formed the body of the mausoleum. Compared to when he first saw it from afar, its grandeur immediately increased by countless times. A pressure and a solemn feeling greeted him. Qin Changsheng noticed that in the surroundings of the mausoleum, there were 10 stone pillars. These stone pillars were several zhang tall, and the patterns carved on their surface had long been eroded by the wind and rain over several hundred years into blurry scars. They seemed very shabby. Compared to the majestic body of the mausoleum, these stone pillars seemed rather strange. It was not for any other reason. It was just that they seemed too short and did not seem to match. You might not know, but there are also many stone pillars outside the Li Palace. When I first saw them, I felt that they were very strange. I didn't think that there would be one here as well. He said, I don't know why, but I also feel that this mausoleum is very strange. It's like the mausoleum of books, but I feel that there's something different about it. Su Yurong smiled somewhat weakly. She thought to herself that when she was 3 years old, she would climb those stone pillars outside the Li Palace every day to play. She leaned on his shoulder and raised her head with difficulty to glance at the mausoleum. With a slightly perplexed expression, she said, the layout of the mausoleum is somewhat similar to the Golden Hall of the Longevity sect. Correct, that's the problem. Qin Changsheng said, this mausoleum is extremely similar to many of the famous buildings outside the Garden of Zhou, but when they're all put together, it feels a little, Su Yurong said at the same time, neither fish nor fowl. After saying these 4 words, the two of them looked at each other and smiled. Towards Zhou Dufu, the most legendary expert, anyone would be incomparably respectful. When they arrived in front of his mausoleum, they probably would not even dare to speak loudly, let alone give such an evaluation. If it were any other cultivator, when they arrived in front of Zhou Dufu's mausoleum, they would not only be unable to control their excitement and have their faces covered in tears, but they would also be shocked speechless. They might even shout loudly to vent the excitement in their hearts. However, Qin Changsheng and Su Yurong did not. They seemed very calm and even seemed to not care. Just when they said these 4 words in a somewhat disrespectful manner, the tiredness and hardships of their escape seemed to disappear without a trace. I really want to see the recommendation tickets in your hands. Chapter 306. Su Yurong and Qin Changsheng purposely said and did this. This didn't mean that they were really calm and didn't care as much as they pretended. It was just that this was the only way they could calm down in the shortest time possible. Su Yurong's face carried a satisfied and calm smile. Before she died, she had finally seen the legendary mausoleum and approached the true secret of the Garden of Zhou. Of course, she was happy. Qin Changsheng looked at the yellow paper umbrella a few times, and confirmed that there was no movement. The strand of sword intent had already disappeared when they saw the mausoleum, so he did not know what this meant. That sword intent had already completed its task of guiding the way. The sword pool was right next to this mausoleum. The surroundings of the mausoleum were boundless white grasslands. Over 10 li away on the opposite side, a few old temples could be faintly seen. They were not sacrificial temples, but rather auxiliary temples. There were no lakes or ponds, so where would the sword pool be? Chen Changsheng did not think for too long. Carrying Su Yurong on his back, he walked towards the mausoleum. Not long after, he arrived in front of the long stone path that seemed like the path of heaven. Stepping on the stone path, dust flew up from the soles of his shoes. For some reason, he gradually increased his speed until he was running. Su Yurong hugged his neck and thought with a smile. After all, he was a young man around 20 years of age. No matter how calm and composed he was, it was just an illusion. That was right. The Snow Mountain sect inherited the bloodline of the Black Frost Dragon, and the Black Frost Dragon was famous among the dragons for loving gold and silver. This mausoleum definitely had countless treasures, so how could his footsteps not be hurried? Chen Changsheng's injuries gradually healed. Although he was still tired, his speed was very fast. Not long after, he had run to the end of the several thousand zhang long divine path with Su Yurong on his back, arriving at the center of the huge mausoleum. Looking at the heavy stone door in front of him that was over 100 feet tall, he took a deep breath and pushed forward with his palms, only to find that it was unexpectedly easy. Without a sound, the door of the mausoleum was pushed open. The crack that grew wider and wider spurted out some fine dust. Chen Changsheng unsheathed his dagger and held it horizontally in front of him. He walked into the mausoleum, very vigilant. Su Yurong leaned on his shoulder. Her expression was also solemn. Her fingers kept flexing and stretching as she silently calculated and deduced. This mausoleum could be said to be the most mysterious place in the Eastern continent. Within it was buried the man who had once terrorized the entire world. By now, they naturally already knew that the mysterious plains of the unsetting sun was only the mausoleum of this mausoleum. Even the mausoleum was so vast and dangerous, let alone the main body of the mausoleum. No one knew what was in this mausoleum. Just a few steps into the stone door, suddenly, a ray of light appeared in the darkness in the distance. It was as if someone had lit a bonfire in the wilderness on a starless night. Chen Changsheng stared into the distance, ready to fight or flee at any moment. In the next moment, a second ray of light shone from the depths of the mausoleum. Soon after, more and more rays of light appeared, heading towards them, forming two bright rays of light. Finally, the light came to them. It turned out that the luminous pearls embedded in the walls of the tunnel had lit up. These luminous pearls were perfectly round, crystal clear, and each of them was the size of a bowl. These luminous pearls were not as perfect as the one Luo Luo had given him, but they were definitely not smaller than the luminous pearls on the dew platform. Moreover, this tunnel was very long, leading to the depths of the mausoleum. There were at least several thousand luminous pearls on the walls. It was really hard to imagine, back when Zhou Dufu was building his mausoleum, where did he find so many luminous pearls that were almost exactly the same? Under the soft illumination of the luminous pearls, he carried Su Yurong into the depths of the mausoleum. This tunnel leading to the depths of the mausoleum should be the underworld path of the mausoleum designed by the emperor, meaning that it led to the netherworld. Of course, in the records of the Orthodoxy, this tunnel was usually called the Path of Light, meaning that it led to the boundless divine kingdom of light in the Sea of Stars. It was just like the stone path that spanned several thousand zhang outside the mausoleum. It was called the Divine Path, meaning that it led to the boundless divine kingdom of light in the Sea of Stars. As they walked in the long tunnel, only the echoes of their footsteps could be heard. Even with the luminous pearls illuminating the path ahead, it still seemed somewhat sinister and terrifying. Chen Changsheng suddenly felt a faint chill in his heart. He split off a strand of his spiritual sense to observe, and discovered that in the cold lake outside his ethereal palace, The black dragon seemed to show signs of awakening. He could not help but be slightly startled, then revealed a smile at the corner of his lips. He thought to himself, "It really is worthy of being the legendary black frost dragon that loves jewels and crystals the most. Even in its slumber, it can still sense the existence of the luminous pearls." Su Yurong saw that his face suddenly revealed a smile. She was very confused, but also felt that it was somewhat strange, so she asked him softly. Qin Changsheng did not know how to explain, so he could only smile again, looking somewhat foolish. Out of their expectations, this tunnel did not have any traps, nor did they encounter those fierce beasts that guarded the mausoleum. Just like that, they walked to the deepest part of the mausoleum, and nothing happened. At the end of the path of light was another stone door. When Qin Changsheng placed his hand on it, he very naturally thought of the scene when he was trapped by Mou in the Tong Palace during the Ivy Festival, walked to the bottom of the Black Dragon Pond, and pushed open that stone door. At that time, he pushed open that stone door with the thought that he would definitely die. He had never thought that he would encounter the black dragon behind the stone door, and this encounter had already saved his life several times. If he pushed open this stone door, what would he encounter? Accompanied by an extremely soft grinding sound, the stone door was slowly pushed open. This stone door had not been opened for several hundred years. Behind the door was a world that no one had visited for several hundred years. Stone pillars several dozen zhang tall supported the dome. The space seemed incomparably large. In the depths of the mausoleum, it was not a tomb, but a palace. In the deepest part of the palace, there was a black stone coffin. Qin Changsheng carried Su Yurong on his back and walked in front of the black stone coffin. Only then did he discover that the black stone coffin was incomparably large, just like a mountain of black stone. Standing in front of the black stone coffin, their figures were very small. This stone coffin was made from black nightmare stone. Its surface was dull and lusterless, giving off a sense of serenity. There were no cracks or traces of being pieced together. It was extremely likely that it was made from a single piece of black nightmare stone. Qin Changsheng silently thought, could this really be a mountain of black stone? There were no patterns on the surface of the black nightmare stone coffin, nor were there any words that indicated the identity of the person in the coffin. This made it even more solemn. At this moment, the man that was quietly lying in the black nightmare stone coffin did not need any patterns to add luster to him, nor did he need any records to sing his praises. When that man was young, he was once known as the #1 expert of Luo Shui. Afterwards, he defeated Emperor Taizong outside of Luoyang, and thus became known as the #1 expert of the Central Plains. Afterwards, he traveled far to the south, defeated countless experts from the Longevity Sect and Scholatry Manor, flattened the mountain gate of South Stream Temple, and tore off the veil of the current Holy Maiden. From then on, he was known as the #1 expert of humanity. Afterwards, while surrounded by countless experts of the demon race, he heavily injured the demon lord and drifted far away. As a result, he was known as the #1 expert of the continent. The #1 expert of the continent did not even have a time limit. It was not limited to that era, but looking back 500 years and looking back 500 years, he would always be the strongest. As a result, he had another title, the #1 expert in 1,000 years. Looking around the universe, he was invincible. Perhaps it was that lonely feeling that caused him to disappear, leaving behind a legend that could not be replicated. In the end, people called him the #1 expert under the starry sky. He used an entire black nightmare stone mountain as a coffin, used a grassland where the sun never sets as a cemetery, and used a world as his own seal. Why would he need to erect a tombstone and carve his name on it? He was Zhou Du Fu. He could only be Zhou Du Fu. Standing in front of the huge black nightmare stone coffin, Qin Changsheng was silent for a while. After a simple bow, he carried Su Yurong on his back and continued forward, not stopping for a long time. Su Yurong was somewhat unable to understand his calmness and asked, "You should know who the person in this black stone coffin is." Qin Changsheng said, as if he was reciting from a book, "The #1 expert under the starry sky, the undefeated legend, the sworn brother of His Majesty the first emperor of the Zhou dynasty. If it was only strength, it would not have been enough for him to be remembered by the world for such a long time. Su Yurong said, there is actually a most important reason why humans were able to defeat the demon race, but it had always been deliberately forgotten by the history books and people. That was because Zhou Dufu defeated and heavily injured the demon lord. Chen Changsheng did not stop his steps. Instead, he quickened his pace and said, I know about this matter, and I also understand the importance of this matter. As a result, other than being a legend, he is also a hero. Su Yurong said, most of the young cultivators I have met saw him as an idol and worshipped him fervently. If they could come before Zhou Dufu's coffin, they would definitely kneel down and worship him. They would not be as indifferent as you. If it was any other time, I would probably be the same. Chen Changsheng said, but right now we do not have the time to reminisce about the past, and he is after all already dead. Su Yurong asked so. Chen Changsheng said, no matter how much of a hero, no matter how great a legend, as long as they are dead, they cannot wake up again. They have no way of telling us how to continue living. Our current situation is very bad. If we still only think about mourning our senior at this time, then we will very quickly become the target of mourning. Of course, it is even more likely that we will be quickly forgotten by people. After saying these words, they had already arrived at the stone steps at the back of the mausoleum. In front of them was a row of doors. The ground in front of the doors was covered in a thin layer of dust. There were no traces of it, not even the traces of wind. It seemed that this mausoleum had indeed never been opened, and no one had ever entered. They were the first group of visitors. Just like the mausoleum's mausoleum doors, the doors of these stone rooms also did not have locks. Walking into the first stone room, a turbid wind with a rotten smell blew against his face. He held his breath and squinted his eyes. Borrowing the light that leaked in from behind him, he looked into the room. He saw that there were many rotten wooden racks in the stone room, and at least several hundred magical artifacts were scattered everywhere. From their shapes, those magical artifacts were definitely not ordinary. It was just that because they had been left in use for too long, the chi on the magical artifact had already dissipated. They were no different from scrap metal. Suddenly, Su Yurong let out a soft cry of surprise. Chen Changxing followed her gaze and looked over. He saw that in the pile of rotten wood at the very corner, there seemed to be something. The most annoying part is the forbidden words. Zhou Dufu had to appear so many times in the heavens' chosen record. It's tiring, but the problem is that it doesn't look good. Also, the problem of how the ferret became the roasted meat in Chen Changxing's hands after being turned into smoke by Su Yurong is completely unsolvable. I can only say that for the sake of sacrifice, I dare to have the ferret die 3 times. The next chapter is still after 7 in the evening. Chapter 307. Zhou Dufu's mausoleum naturally did not use ordinary items. The wooden shelf that displayed the magical artifacts should have been made from the extremely expensive 5-colored pear wood. It was just that this number 1 expert under the starry sky clearly did not know much about antiques. He only knew that 5-colored pear wood was extremely rare and resistant to insects, but he did not know that this kind of hardwood needed to be preserved in a moist environment. In the dry and cold environment of the mausoleum, it only needed a few decades to rot. The pile of rotten wood in the corner of the stone room might have been able to be sold for a sky-high price when it was in perfect condition, but now it was just a pile of worthless rotten wood. What could make a genius girl like Su Yurong cry out in surprise was naturally not the pile of rotten wood, but the thing buried in the wood. Chen Changsheng walked over and picked up a magical artifact that looked like a ruler. He pushed aside the pile of rotten wood and discovered that there was also a magical artifact buried underneath. The magical artifact had a dark luster and was made of some unknown material. It was incomparably glossy to the touch and was very similar to the fossil of a strange tree that could be found by the sea in the west. What is this? He handed the black magical artifact to Su Yurong and asked. Su Yurong accepted the object and carefully examined it for a very long time. She slowly stroked it with her finger and finally said, "If I'm not mistaken, This should be White Emperor City's sole pivot. Chen Changshen was somewhat surprised. He had never seen this name in the 3,000 scriptures of the Taoist canon. He asked, "Soul pivot?" Su Yurong returned the black magical artifact to him and used her eyes to indicate that he should keep it well. She said, "Yes, the most inconceivable magical power of this soul pivot is that it can control monsters. Even those legendary monsters that are about to step into the divine domain are unable to resist the orders of the soul pivot." The reason why the White Emperor clan was able to rule over the demi-human domain for so many years was because of this. Of course, this is also their greatest secret. Other than the White Emperor clan, very few outsiders know about it. If I had not seen a portrait from my elders, I probably would not have recognized it either. After a slight pause, she continued, "I did not think that this supreme treasure of the demi-humans would actually be stolen from White Emperor City by Zhou Dufu and used in the Garden of Zhou. The reason why the monsters in that plain do not dare to approach the mausoleum, but they have silently guarded the mausoleum for several hundred years might be because of the existence of the soul pivot." Chen Changshen didn't expect this magic tool to be such an important item. He didn't hesitate to store it away. Logically, as well as according to his usual temperament, he should have discussed with Su Yurong how to divide the treasures found in the mausoleum. However, he was in a hurry to find other things, so he did not have the time to talk about this. More importantly, since the soul pivot belonged to the White Emperor clan, he believed that it should naturally be returned to Luoluo. Su Yurong saw all of his actions, but did not have any reaction. The tacit understanding and trust they had built up along the way had long since made it very difficult for misunderstandings to occur between them. On the contrary, she even reminded him, according to the description on that drawing, the soul pivot should be compatible with the soul wood in order to display its full power, but the soul wood is not here. Chen Changsheng took the old iron ruler-like magic tool and casually rummaged through the pile of rotten wood. Su Yurong looked at the magic tools that he had found and introduced them one by one. Only then did he know that these magic tools that were like scrap metal were all very famous in the past. There were even 3 magic tools that had once been ranked on the tier of legendary weapons issued by the Pavilion of Divination. These magic tools were not able to make his footsteps stop for a long time. After confirming that the stone room did not have what he was looking for, he turned around and left without hesitation. He walked towards the second stone room on the right. As he moved, he finally found the time to say to Su Yurong, "Let's split everything we find equally." Su Yurong leaned on his shoulder and said with a light laugh, "If we can get out." The items in the second stone room had not rotted. Although those items were not the most precious things in the world, they were definitely things that everyone liked. Even if they were often criticized by some refined scholars as being tacky or even described as dung, if they were to see the scene in front of them, they would still tremble with excitement and find it hard to control themselves. It was a room full of gold. Even after several hundred years, it still shone with a dazzling light, forcing everyone to squint their eyes when they saw it, as if only by doing so would they not be burned. Su Yurong was shocked speechless. She thought to herself, just how many raids and exterminations did Zhou Dufu do when he roamed the continent? Chen Changsheng was much calmer. It was not because he had a high cultivation and could see riches and honor as fleeting clouds, but because he had once seen even more gold in that cold space beneath the great Zhou imperial palace. Those who had experience obviously would not be excited easily, but this did not mean that he was not interested in this room full of gold. Previously, he had confirmed that there were no dangers in the mausoleum, so he had already sheathed his dagger. Now he took the dagger and the sheath off his waist, walked into the room full of gold, and began to point. Even the mischievous rocks had to nod their heads when the expert spoke. He did not have the ability to enlighten gold and enlighten it. Touching rocks could turn them into gold, but he did not want to turn the gold back into rock, so that later generations could comprehend the principle of all things returning to one and embracing simplicity and unchanging. What he wanted to do was to collect all of the gold, not leaving a single piece behind. If the black dragon were to wake up and discover that he had actually left behind a piece of gold, it would definitely not be over with him. As the sheath in his hand moved, the gold in the stone room decreased at a visible rate until it completely disappeared. It was unknown where it had gone. Su Yurong had long known that there was something strange about his sword. It should be a spatial artifact. She also had similar artifacts on her body. The Tong arrow, the Wu Bao, and a few close-fitting clothes were all stored inside. As a result, she was not surprised, but rather curious. The space in his sword seemed to be a little too large. Along the way, she had already seen him stuff too many things into it. Moving away all of the gold in the room did not take up too much time. Chen Chong Sheng quickly left with her on his back, arriving at the third stone room. This stone room was filled with crystals. As time passed, the energy contained within the crystals had somewhat dissipated. Only about a third of their original energy remained, but they were still good items. Without needing Su Yurong to say anything, he dealt with them in the same manner as he did in the second stone room. Very quickly, the room was swept clean. The fourth stone room was filled with various treasures. This time, Chen Chongsheng's movements were even faster. Su Yurong only had time to blink her eyes. Without saying a word, those night pearls, corals, jadeites, white jades, and other treasures were all collected into his sheath. It was to the point where she wondered if her eyes were playing tricks on her. Perhaps there are no such items in this stone room at all. The fifth stone room was filled with various secret manuals and cultivation methods. Su Yurong had originally thought that this time, he would be more cautious to ensure that the secret manuals and cultivation methods would not be damaged in the process of moving them. It must be known that these secret manuals and cultivation methods belonged to the countless experts of the continent back then. They represented Zhou Du Fu's countless battles. They were the history of the cultivation world. Their value and importance did not need to be asked. However, Chen Chongsheng still left the stone room very quickly. He did not stay for a long time. Wherever the tip of his sword pointed, there was nothing. In his eyes, these secret manuals and cultivation methods seemed to be no different from worthless waste paper. Su Yurong did not understand. When he reached the entrance of the sixth stone room, he only took a glance inside before turning around and leaving. This kind of confusion reached its peak. She remembered that before, no matter if he was facing the room full of gold or the magical artifacts and crystals, his eyes were always so clear. There was not a hint of greed in them. There was not even a hint of the joy that everyone should have. When he took away the gold, crystals, and magical artifacts, he did not seem to care at all. It was as if he just took them because he saw them. Then what was he looking for? "Is there anything in this mausoleum that you must obtain?" she asked. Chen Chongsheng did not answer her question. He did not have the time to answer her question. He ran between the stone rooms, his speed increasing. When he walked in the ninth stone room, Su Yurong noticed that his eyes finally lit up. Moreover, a hint of joy appeared. There were no shelves in this stone room. Many bottles and jars were placed on the floor extremely casually. Some of the bottles were made of celadon, while some jars were very similar to the crockery used to simmer chicken soup. Fortunately, they were not placed on the shelves, or else these bottles and jars would definitely have been broken. Chen Sheng walked in front of these bottles and jars. His fingers slowly moved over them, and his gaze seemed to be extremely focused. Suddenly, his finger stopped. He picked up a jade box. There was no label on the box, so it was unknown what was inside. The lid of the jade box was opened, and an extremely light fragrance floated out. He brought it up to his nose and sniffed it. After tasting it for a while, he confirmed that there was no mistake. The joy in his eyes spread to his face, and at the same time, his body finally relaxed. Su Yurong leaned on his body and felt it the clearest. She discovered that his two shoulders had clearly become much softer and were no longer as stiff and tense as before. "What is this?" she asked. "This is a flowing fire pill." Chen Chongsheng took out a pill from the box and said, "The main ingredient is the juice of the fire thorn. It has an extremely strong fire attribute and can be ranked in the top 3 in the world. It has a miraculous effect on blood production, especially for you." After hearing this, Su Yurong was stunned. She remained silent for a very long time without saying anything. Only now did she understand why he was so nervous why his footsteps were so hurried, and why he disregarded the crystals, treasures, and secret manuals. It turned out that he was in a hurry to find medicine for her. This moved her very much. She cultivated the way beyond the world, and what she wanted was to get rid of the mortal world. If she wanted her Tao heart to be clear, she could not be happy about things or grieve over people. So in the eyes of the world, she was very proud, very clear, and cold. She was a phoenix high above. She also thought of herself like this. She believed that she should not have these emotions that harmed her Tao heart, and that she would not be moved by anything. In this grassland, from that patch of reeds to this mausoleum, there had already been several times when she was about to be truly moved by him, but she had always used an unimaginable mental strength to control it. For someone like her, it was relatively easy to control sorrow and joy, and it was also very easy to control anger. However, being moved was a very special kind of emotion, and it was very difficult to control. This kind of emotion would never suddenly appear. It required a very long time to soak in, but the moment it truly appeared, it would definitely be sudden. It required a certain point. Accumulate, then release. This phrase could be used to describe cultivation, but it could also be used to describe this kind of emotion. At this moment, this kind of emotion finally broke through the hard rock wall and began to grow ostentatiously in the cool breeze. She was truly moved. Please vote for me. Let me be moved as well. Have a good weekend. Chapter 308. Chun Chang. Sheng did not know what she was thinking at the moment, nor did he know that in such a short time, her emotions had changed so much. He took out the flowing fire pill from the jade box and put it next to her lips. Then he quickly, and even somewhat rudely, shoved it in. Su Yurong's lips opened slightly. She was about to say something to express her gratitude, but before she could say anything, she was blocked by the pill. You can't drink water for an hour, or else it will lower the heat in the pill. Chun Chang Sheng looked at her face that was red from choking and said seriously, but he felt a little uneasy. The flowing fire pill was very big. Su Yurong could not speak at all. She took a long time to swallow it. It was very difficult, and then she coughed. After a while, she felt a little better. She looked at him and said angrily, "Even if I can't drink water, at least tell me in advance. Don't you know how uncomfortable coughing is?" Although she said it angrily, her voice was a little faint. It was a complaint, but also a little like a spoiled child. Chun Chang Sheng could not feel it. He said embarrassedly, "I'm sorry, I was a little anxious. But don't be afraid of coughing. It's not choking. It should be a normal phenomenon of detoxification." Su Yurong herself did not notice the girlish expression she showed before, but for some reason, she felt a little embarrassed. She said softly, "I don't know if it's the effect of the pill, but I'm a little sleepy." How is this a normal phenomenon of detoxification? He was just finding something to say. How could the effect of the pill take effect so quickly? He just did not know how to respond. In the end, it was still as Tang 36 had said in the Plum Garden Inn in the capital. He and she were really two people that made people speechless. No matter if it was the effect of the pill or some other reason, Su Yurong was really a little sleepy. He helped her to the corridor outside the stone room that was sheltered from the wind. He took out a few pieces of cloth from the seventh stone room and covered her. The most precious silks and satin in the tomb, including the incomparably rare snow silk quilt, had all been turned into shreds by time. Interestingly, the most worthless cotton was still as good as before. He covered her with a curtain made of cotton. Looking at the sleeping girl, he secretly prayed that the flowing fire pill still had enough medicinal power. Then he walked back to the stone room and opened the jade box again. He carefully sniffed it, but the uneasiness in his heart did not disappear. Instead, it became stronger and stronger. After finding a few kinds of spirit herbs whose medicinal power had not completely dissipated, he finally had the time to look at his harvest from the previous stone rooms. He used his divine sense to sweep around, and the first thing he looked at were the secret manuals and cultivation methods. He had been well versed in the Taoist canon since he was a child. After he went to the capital, he had also seriously read the tens of thousands of books in the library of the Tradition Academy. Now that he was looking at these secret manuals and techniques, he only needed to see the name to be able to think of the corresponding sect or school. Different from what people imagined, these secret manuals and techniques were not rare, so it was naturally impossible for him to achieve great success overnight. Speaking of which, the experts who had the qualifications to become Zhou Dufu's opponent all came from famous sects or sects in the world. They had become ghosts under Zhou Dufu's blade, but the inheritance of the sects or sects they belonged to had not been severed. It was just like how the secrets of the Mount Li sword sect had been taken away by the White Emperor clan, but Mount Li was still powerful. However, it was still just like the secrets of the Mount Li sword sect sword style. These secret manuals and techniques were naturally extremely precious, at least to those sects or sects, because they were all original copies. Afterwards, he began to examine the magical artifacts. Because of time, the majority of the magical artifacts in the stone rooms had lost their power. Under Su Yorong's guidance, the few magical artifacts he had put away still had some power, but they were still far from what they were in the past. They could not even be compared to the divine weapons on the tier of legendary weapons. Only the Black Soul Pivot was an exception. Time really was the world's most powerful magical artifact. Qin Changsheng suddenly had a few ideas. Zhou Dufu was this continent's true legend, a unique existence. The Garden of Zhou was his world, and this place was his mausoleum. Logically speaking, those who had the qualifications to be buried with him should have even better things. Had those things been taken away by someone else? The floor of the long corridor in front of the 9 stone rooms was covered in a thin layer of dust, and there were many messy footprints on it. However, those footprints were all left by him. The magical artifacts, treasures, and secret manuals were all still there, proving that no one had come here before. In the past several hundred years, there had been countless cultivators who wanted to find Zhou Dufu's mausoleum and obtain his legacy and treasures. Those cultivators were either overflowing with talent or had made extremely ample preparations. They were all at least at the peak of ethereal opening, and only then did they dare to enter the mysterious plains of the unsetting sun. However, before they could reach this place, they died on the way. The reason he was able to find his way out of the plains and arrive at this mausoleum was not because he was more outstanding or stronger than those seniors, but because he had an umbrella. Thinking of this, he once again looked at the yellow paper umbrella in his hands. After walking into the mausoleum, he did not put away the umbrella. If he did not have the yellow paper umbrella and followed the faintly discernible sword intent to guide them, it would have been impossible for them to reach this place. It was even more likely that they would have already lost their way in the dangerous plains and then become food for the monster hordes. However, how would he leave this place? Would he still have to rely on the yellow paper umbrella, or would he have to find that sword intent? He always felt that the yellow paper umbrella bringing him here was the call of fate. Yes, he believed in fate. This sounded very absurd, because the reason he had come to the capital from Xining Village's old temple was to change his own fate. However, in the deepest part of his spiritual world, he truly believed in the existence of fate. He believed in the existence of fate even more than anyone else. There had to be a mountain in front of him so that he could cross this mountain. There had to be a great undulating river so that he could cross this river. There had to be a goal so that he could advance towards it. There had to be fate so that he could change fate. At the end of his notebook, Wang Zhizi said, "There is no fate." These 4 words could be said to be world-shaking, but to him, it was a whole new world. His view was different from Wang Zhizi's. It had to be different. He wanted to clearly see his own fate and then change it. If fate allowed him to meet so many people in the capital and so many things, then finally brought him into the Garden of Zhou. Then, in the Garden of Zhou, what kind of fate was waiting for him? The yellow paper umbrella had sensed that sword intent and brought him here, so there had to be some deep meaning hidden within. If he wanted to leave the Garden of Zhou, did that mean that he needed to find that sword intent? Was that sword intent in the sword pool? And where was the sword pool? After walking through the long passageway, he arrived outside the mausoleum. He stood on the high platform, his left hand supporting his waist and his right hand holding the yellow paper umbrella. He looked at the grassland in front of him. It was already dusk, and the distant sun had already arrived at its fixed position every night, the edge of the grassland, above the horizon. Under the warm red light, the boundless grassland seemed to be burning. The pools of water hidden in the grassland were like countless little mirrors, reflecting the appearance of the sky. Behind him was Zhou Dufu's mausoleum. If the person who saw this scene was a scholar who grieved over the changing seasons, he would probably feel even more sorrow and lament that everything in the world could not defeat time. However, he did not. The setting sun was still hanging on the distant edge of the grassland, but it suddenly began to rain around the mausoleum. He raised a yellow paper umbrella. Pa 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 pa. The raindrops fell on the surface of the umbrella and turned into countless little splashes. They constantly jumped and then fell. He released his spiritual sense and extended it through the handle of the umbrella all the way to the surface of the umbrella. Finally, it jumped like those little splashes and left, dispersing into the grassland around the mausoleum. He was familiar with the Taoist canons and was sure that the strand of sword intent could not have its own consciousness. Since it did not have its own consciousness, it could not change its own state. At the very beginning, he was able to sense it at the edge of the cold pool because the sword intent had always existed, waiting to be discovered. Then now, the sword intent should not and could not disappear on its own. If an object did not disappear on its own and could not be found, then it must have been hidden by someone. Chun Chong Sheng stood in the rain and released his spiritual sense into the grassland, searching for his target. At the same time, he began to sort out the changes that occurred when he approached the mausoleum. The moment Suyu Rong saw the mausoleum, the strand of sword intent disappeared. At the time, he thought that the sword intent had completed its mission of bringing the yellow paper umbrella to this place, so it disappeared. Now that he had calmed down and deduced from before, he was naturally certain that this was not the case. That strand of sword intent should have been hidden by a certain person. That person should be the mausoleum. He turned his head to look at the mausoleum behind him. The mausoleum was piled up with huge rocks. The higher one went, the steeper it became. It was unbelievably tall. He stood in the middle of the mausoleum. In his eyes, the mausoleum was so tall that it seemed to pierce through the clouds in the sky. His gaze followed the top of the mausoleum and landed on the gloomy clouds. He saw that the black clouds were roiling, and lightning would occasionally flash in the depths. It seemed especially terrifying. Even though he was several thousand zhang away, he could still clearly feel the powerful qi in the clouds that was enough to destroy the world. The mausoleum was the core of the Garden of Zhou, so this qi should be the manifestation of the laws of the Garden of Zhou. The rain grew heavier and heavier, and the huge rocks in the mausoleum were all wet. Between every rock, there were countless thin waterfalls flowing. If someone were to look from outside the mausoleum, they would definitely feel that this scene was very spectacular, with a soul-stirring beauty. However, he, who was standing in the mausoleum, could only feel that it was soul-stirring. Naturally, he could not feel the beauty. If I have time, I should leave the range of the mausoleum's pressure and see if that strand of sword intent will appear again. He thought silently, and then faintly heard someone call him. Holding the yellow paper umbrella, he walked into the mausoleum again. Suyu Rong had already woken up. Her face was still pale, but she seemed to be better and had recovered some of her energy. He asked, "You were calling me?" The rain outside the mausoleum was too heavy. Although he had an umbrella, he was still wet, and he looked rather miserable. Suyu Rong did not make fun of him. She shook her head and said softly, "You heard wrong." Chun Chongsheng thought that he was probably too worried about her injuries and really had heard wrong. Suyu Rong looked at him quietly, and the two hands under the sackcloth slightly clenched. Previously, when she had woken up, she did not see him by her side, and the surroundings were dark. She was actually somewhat afraid, or more accurately, flustered. Ever since her bloodline had awakened, she had never been flustered. She knew that this had nothing to do with her dependence on him, and even more so, it had nothing to do with those things. This was a sign of her declining willpower. She became weaker and weaker, and even her bright Tao heart began to gradually dim. This was a sign of death. Chen Changsheng squatted down beside her and extended his hand to take her pulse. After a long period of silence, he smiled and said, "Yes, the medicinal power is currently dispersing. Even if the poison is not completely removed, there shouldn't be any major problems." Lies were about 9 truths and 1 falsehood. Not a single word in his words was true. Su Yurong looked at his eyes and said indifferently, "Do you know that your smile is very fake?" Chen Chongqing's body slightly stiffened, and he laughed and said, "How can a smile be fake?" Su Yurong smiled and said, "It's not fake, it's stupid." Chen Chongqing pretended to be a little unhappy and said, "I just don't like your cold and proud tone. I will pay attention, at least in front of you." Su Yurong said something that he did not expect. Chen Chongqing was stunned. Su Yurong smiled and continued, "But just now, your smile looked like you were crying. It was indeed very stupid, and anyone could see that it was fake." Chen Chongqing did not know what to say. He lowered his head, stretched out his hand, and pulled down the sackcloth to cover her feet. "That medicine is useless, right?" She looked at his eyes, and her expression was very calm, as if she did not know that his answer would determine her fate. The next chapter is still at 7:15 p.m. It feels like a draft. I'm really not used to it. I'm a little cocky. Also, these few chapters have been revised many times. I dare to let everyone take a closer look. Chapter 309. Time was truly an unimaginable monster. It could cause the strongest man under the stars to die, and it could also cause the most precious pills to become useless. Zhou Dufu may not have understood medicine, but the pills he collected, no matter the environment or the tools he used, were all very particular. But even so, there was still no way to preserve the efficacy of the pills after hundreds of years. Su Yurong received confirmation from his silence. She thought about it and then said, "If that's the case, then I'll sleep a little longer." At this time, she was no longer coughing and very peacefully fell asleep. If she was about to enter eternal sleep, she probably wouldn't be able to fall asleep before then. Chen Chongsheng looked at the sleeping girl and felt endless admiration and respect. How strong of willpower and mental strength did she have to be able to sleep peacefully in such a situation? That flowing fire pill lost its effect. How could he save her? He hesitated for a while and decided to use the method that made him hesitate for more than 10 days in the grasslands, pushing blood with golden needles. Pushing blood with golden needles was a method that stimulated vitality and the strength of blood vessels. It was extremely harmful to people. Before his teacher Taoist Ji successfully modified it, this acupuncture method was basically classified as evil by the orthodoxy and forbidden to be used. Even now, this acupuncture method couldn't completely avoid serious side effects, so it was usually only used when patients are near death. From a certain perspective, pushing blood with golden needles was like the last mouthful of old ginseng soup. Since he made his decision, he didn't hesitate anymore. He sat behind Su Yurong and untied the golden thread that was wrapped around the ring finger of his left hand. His divine sense moved slightly, and the golden thread was as straight as a needle. It pierced into the back of her neck like lightning. Pushing blood with golden needles was very difficult. The most difficult part was to insert the needle into the patient's meridian. She was currently in deep sleep, so it was perfect. Su Yurong frowned slightly and woke up from some pain. "Don't move, I'm treating you." Chen Chongqing knew that she wasn't old, but she was calm in the face of danger. As long as he explained it clearly, she would cooperate. As expected, Su Yurong quickly calmed down. His cold, true essence slowly entered her body through the golden needles. Like a tide, it moved through her meridians and blood vessels, dispersing the poison that had accumulated in her diaphragm. At the same time, it also dispelled the suspicion that she previously had. Bean-sized beads of sweat continuously appeared on Chen Chongsheng's forehead. They were then frozen into ice beads and rolled to the ground, making a crisp sound. As time passed, the ground around the two of them was covered with frozen beads of sweat, looking like a sea of pearls. Some of the ice beads rolled down the stone steps and went very far away. only stopping when they came into contact with a huge black nightmare sarcophagus. After a long time, the golden needles retracted from the back of Su Yurong's neck and wrapped around Chun Changsheng's fingers again. After a long time, the golden needles came back from the back of Su Yu. He lowered his head and looked at the ice beads on the ground. He was a little sad, but he was even more unwilling. Pushing the blood with the golden needle was the last method he could think of. It was very dangerous and violent, but even so, it did not have any effect. This kind of acupuncture technique could stimulate a human's vitality and bloodline. Even an old man on the verge of death could regain some of his spirit and even snatch a glimmer of life from the netherworld. However, this method had no effect on Su Yurong. Her blood vessels had already dried up. Her vitality had long since been exhausted from the continuous battles and journeys. Without wood, no matter how high the temperature of the flame was, how could it be ignited? I'm sorry. The one who said this was not Qin Changsheng, but Su Yurong. She looked at him and smiled. Although I don't understand medicine, I know that the method you used just now was very impressive. It's a pity that my patient is too disappointing. This was the truth. Her sacred light technique had saved many people in the Garden of Zhou, but it was a completely different matter for medicine. Qin Changsheng raised his head and looked at her slightly swollen but still elegant face. His mood was very gloomy. Your essence blood has already been exhausted. Other than replenishing blood, there is no other method. However, we tried a few days ago. Your blood vessels are rather special. The blood of monsters is meaningless to you. I even believe that other than your own blood, no other blood is meaningful to you. Then, even if we can leave the Garden of Zhou, we might not be able to cure you. He explained the current situation very honestly to her. Explaining why she had died to the girl who was about to die had nothing to do with his respect for her powerful willpower. Instead, it was because he had a powerful and even stubborn attitude towards death. People did not know how they came to this world, so when they left this world, they should be clear-headed. Only then would it not be a wasted trip to this world. He did not explain his thoughts to Su Yurong. However, Su Yurong was not sad, nor did she vent her anger on him. As if she understood what he meant, she smiled and said, "But if we can leave the Garden of Zhou, at least you can survive." After coming to the mausoleum, Su Yurong often smiled, but her smile was actually very weak. Qin Changsheng could not even bear to look at it. "I haven't found a way to leave the Garden of Zhou. I don't know if this will make you happier." He looked at her and said with a smile. He knew that she could not be happy because of this, but he hoped that she would be happy because of his unfunny joke. Su Yurong did not become happy. Instead, the smile on her face gradually faded. She looked at him and said calmly, "Looks like I will die." Because of this sentence that was not the first time he had heard it, Qin Changsheng suddenly felt as if his chest had been fiercely smashed by a rock. He felt extremely sad. He remembered that night. She had said that she was only 15, the same age as him, to be in the prime of one's youth. Yet one's life had come to an end. This was truly the saddest thing in the world. It was a sorrow that he had experienced countless nights in advance. He had prepared for death for a very long time. There was no one who had prepared more than him. However, now that she was about to die in front of him, he still could not do anything. "I don't want to die." Su Yurong looked at him and said very seriously. When she said these words, she was not sad. Her expression was still calm, because she was not begging for his pity. She was only telling him her final thoughts. "You won't die," Qin Changsheng said. Su Yurong said, "You know that I can't accept such unconvincing consolation." Qin Changsheng suddenly thought of something and became somewhat absent-minded. With a slightly trembling voice, he said, "You won't die." Su Yurong's expression changed slightly. She did not understand why his mood had suddenly changed. "You won't die," Qin Changsheng repeated for the third time. However, this time, his voice was abnormally calm and certain. His clear eyes were incomparably bright. Su Yurong thought that he was a little crazy. She said, "You don't need to bear any responsibility for my death." Qin Changsheng said, "But I don't want you to die." Su Yurong used a tired voice to tease him. "Could it be that you're a god? If you don't want someone to die, they won't die." "Yes." Chen Changsheng's clear voice reverberated in the spacious mausoleum. It was that certain. Su Yurong stared at him blankly. He began to laugh. He did not know why fate had brought him into the garden of Zhou, and then to this mausoleum. Was it because of that sword intent, or was it something else? However, he now knew one thing. Perhaps he could change this girl's fate. In other words, he was her fate, or at least a part of it. Chapter 310. The reason why he thought this way was because Chen Changsheng thought of a method that could save her life. The 3,000 scrolls of the Way didn't mention this method. There were also no related records in medical knowledge. This method had never been used by anyone. It sounded ridiculous and unreasonable, but he felt more and more strongly that this method might be useful. If his guess was true, then just like what Su Yurong said, whoever he didn't want to die, that person wouldn't die easily. But it might not be useful, and his senior definitely wouldn't agree. He didn't think for too long. He looked at Su Yurong and said seriously, "Later, I will use a method to tell you in advance. I hope you won't be too surprised." Su Yurong saw that his eyes were clear and also became serious. She asked what method. She wasn't afraid of death. That's why she was so indifferent before. But suddenly seeing hope in despair, anyone would feel emotional. She couldn't treat it as a joke. She had to be careful. "Do you know how to save a dead horse?" Chen Changsheng looked at her and asked with a smile. This is a very famous proverb. She thought he used to hear to make a joke. She looked at him helplessly. She told him many times on the road that he didn't have the talent to make jokes. Why did he have to make things difficult for himself? You can only save a dead horse. You don't have blood, so I will give you blood. Chen Changsheng started to roll up his sleeves. Halfway through, he realized that the stacked cuffs were in the way, so he took off his clothes. Many days ago, because Su Yurong was afraid of the cold, his outer clothes were always on her body. He only had one piece of clothing left, which was easy to take off. He quickly took off his clothes, held the short sword, and prepared to cut his wrist. A hand grabbed his left wrist and blocked the edge of the short sword. "You want to give your blood to me?" She stared at his eyes and said seriously, "Although I didn't tell you that my blood is different from normal people, you should know that the blood of the monsters on the road is useless to me. Why try again?" Chen Changsheng looked at her and said, "It's because of this habit that I forgot some things." "What things?" she asked. Chen Changsheng said, "I am not a Yao beast, and my blood is not the blood of the Yao beast." Su Yurong's lips curled up. It was a mocking smile. She wasn't mocking Chen Changsheng's wishful thinking. She was mocking herself. The heavenly phoenix true blood that flowed in her body was the source of all her power and glory. But when she lost that true blood, she discovered that the heavenly phoenix true blood, from her pride, became the cause of her death. Chen Changsheng's blood was naturally different from the blood of Yao beasts. But how could a normal human's blood replace the true blood of the heavenly phoenix? A cry of alarm rang out in the mausoleum. Chen Changsheng didn't care about her wishes. He directly moved her hand away and used the short sword to cut his wrist. He had bathed in dragon blood in the frigid world beneath the well of New North Bridge, which was even more perfect than the most perfect purification. From then on, he possessed unimaginable strength and speed, as well as an even more unimaginable toughness of his body. Relying on these, he was able to consecutively defeat so many geniuses in the grand examination, all the way until he finally obtained first upon the first banner. If it was a normal weapon, even a few divine weapons on the tier of legendary weapons, in his own hands, it would be very difficult to cut his skin. In the ambush by the lake, those two powerful demon beauties, in the end, almost ruptured his internal organs, but they still couldn't leave a single wound on the surface of his body because of this reason. But the short sword in his hand could. This short sword was a gift given to him by Senior Yuren when he left Xining Village's old temple. It looked abnormally normal and was unknown in the world. It didn't even have a figure on the tier of legendary weapons, but Chen Changsheng had never seen a sword sharper than it. No matter if it was Tang 36's Wen Shui's sword or Qi Jian's Mount Li's sword style, they were all inferior to it. With a light sound, a perfectly straight red line appeared on his wrist. Then, that line rapidly spread out to the sides. Blood gushed out from that wound, about to drip down. He had already attached the sheath to the lower part. Without a sound, his blood slowly flowed into the sheath. Just what do you want to do? Su Yurong was very angry, because he didn't listen to her, because he was so stubborn. Then, she smelled a light aroma. It was a very strange aroma. It was lighter than the faintest flower aroma, but thicker than the most fragrant perfume. After that aroma was smelled, it would undergo countless changes. Sometimes it was thick, sometimes it was thin, sometimes it was clear, sometimes it was thick. Sometimes it was the fragrance of a flower, sometimes it was like honey, sometimes it was like a fruit that just came out of the garden, still green, but already had an aroma. What was this aroma? She looked at Chen Changsheng's wrist and confirmed that this aroma came from his blood. Chen Changsheng's blood flowed more and more, and the aroma also became thicker and thicker. As time went on, she felt even more. It was the evilest temptation, but also the purest sweetness. The oldest, but also the freshest. It was extremely beautiful. It was a very complicated and lively aura of life. It was an unimaginably strong life force. Su Yurong looked at Chen Changsheng and was so shocked that she couldn't speak. You should know that even Zhou Du Fu's tomb couldn't gear such a big shock. What was this blood? Just who are you? Are you human? While thinking about these things, she fainted. It wasn't because seeing this scene in front of her and smelling this blood made it hard for her to bear the mental shock, but because before this, Chen Changsheng had already silently inserted the golden needle into her Higu point. He explained to her how he would save her, just to tell her about it, but it didn't mean that he needed her to watch him do it. In order for her to maintain a calm state of mind, letting her fall asleep was the best choice. At the same time, this could also ensure that she wouldn't disturb this process. It should be known that every drop of his blood was very precious. The most important thing was he didn't know how she would react after smelling his blood. Time passed slowly. The blood on his wrist gradually coagulated and the wound gradually closed. He had never done this kind of thing before, and he didn't know if the blood in the sheath was enough. To be safe, he didn't hesitate to pick up the short sword and cut the wound again, even deeper. It was a bit painful, but it was still within an acceptable range. Like this, he repeated it 4 times. Blood flowed from his wrist into the scabbard. After a long time, he thought that it should be enough, right? Suddenly, the scene in front of his eyes became a bit blurry. Was it because he was scared of blood? Why didn't he notice it before? After a while, he woke up a bit and realized that it wasn't because he was scared of blood, nor was it because he was starving. The reason was because he had lost too much blood. The next thing he needed to do was to inject this blood into the girl's body. He used a piece of cloth to tightly tie the wound on his wrist, ensuring that it wouldn't affect his movement and wouldn't let the blood flow out. Then he walked to Su Yurong's side and opened the front of her clothes, revealing her white neck and smooth shoulders. The fingers of his left hand lightly touched her skin, while his right hand held the short sword and slowly followed. A vibration that was no longer clear, not to mention strong, and seemed very weak, transmitted from her skin to his fingertips. It was here. He held the short sword, pressed it against that place, and slightly pushed it in. These few days I have been away from the city, but I can still do 2 chapters a day, thanks to everyone's supervision. Also, the chapter title is very good. Chapter 311. The edge of the sword broke through her skin, cutting open her blood vessels. No blood spurted out. Not even a sliver of blood flowed out because there was basically no blood left in her body. Chen Changsheng took the scabbard and used the opening of the scabbard to point at the wound on her neck. With a slight movement of his spiritual sense, a line of blood came out of the scabbard, as if it had been created from nothingness. The line of blood was extremely thin, seemingly even thinner than a strand of hair. It slowly poured into her blood vessels. During the entire process, he was extremely cautious, and his spiritual sense was condensed to the extreme. There was no sound. There was only the smell. The smell of his blood gradually spread throughout the spacious mausoleum. After an unknown amount of time, he put away the scabbard. His right index finger faintly emitted a chill, and he pressed it against Su Yurong's neck. After a while, confirming that her blood vessels and wound had been sealed by extremely fine ice shards. He began to treat his own wound. The wound on his wrist could clearly be seen, and even the bone could be faintly seen. It slowly healed, or perhaps it was sealed by ice. There were still some bloodstains beside the wound. He remembered what his senior brother had told him in private. After a moment of hesitation, he raised his wrist to his lips and began to carefully lick it, just like a young beast licking its milk. Back then, his senior brother had once told him that if he was injured and bled, he must use this method. Only by eating the blood into his stomach could the smell of the blood not continue to spread. Other than that, no matter how much water was used to wash it, how much sand was used to bury it, or even if he burned it with fire, the smell would not disappear. This was the first time Chun Changsheng had tasted his own blood. In the previous battles, he had almost spat out blood many times and then forcefully swallowed it down. However, at that time, the blood was only in his throat, but this time, the blood was on his tongue. As it turned out, his blood was sweet. He thought to himself, the taste really was very good. It really was delicious. It really was delicious. He still wanted to eat some more. Suddenly, he woke up. His entire body was covered in sweat, which then froze into frost. Previously, he had actually licked faster and faster, harder and harder, like a young beast greedily licking the milk mixed with the blood of its dead mother. If he had not woken up so quickly, he might have even licked the wound on his wrist open. The mausoleum was deathly silent. Only after a long time would there be a light breeze. The frozen beads of sweat on the ground rolled slowly, making a rolling sound. He leaned against the stone pillar tiredly, his face unusually pale, because he had lost too much blood and also because of fear. When he was 10 years old, his soul was expelled from his body, along with his sweat, causing a phenomenon in the world. In the mountain behind Shining Village that was shrouded in clouds and mist, there was an unknown and terrifying life spying on him. From that night onwards, he knew that there was something wrong with his body. It wasn't that he was sick, but that his soul was the most delicious fruit for many living beings. It was an irresistible temptation. If the world finds out about the abnormality of your blood, you will die, and you will definitely face a fate worse than death. His senior brother had said these words to him on the second day of the night when he was 10. At that time, senior martial brother took a long time to express the meaning of this sentence clearly. Because his arms were very sore and weak, he always made mistakes when making gestures. He asked his senior brother why it was like this. Senior martial brother was silent for a very long time. He told him that it was because last night he had been fanning himself the entire time, wanting to fan away the smell that had seeped out of his body as quickly as possible. He asked his senior brother why he was doing this. Senior martial brother was silent for a very long time, and then he told him that last night he had smelled that smell for a very long time and suddenly wanted to suck his blood dry, wanted to eat him. In Chun Changsheng's heart, Senior Yurun was the bravest person in the world, the person who treated him the best. If senior martial brother wanted him to die, he could die, but if senior martial brother wanted to eat him, he thought for a very long time, but he still felt that this matter was too terrifying. The blood that flowed in his body was a delicacy that all living beings yearned for. To the person involved, this was naturally not a good thing. So he did not like his own blood. One could even say that he loathed it, or perhaps even feared it. Because of this state of mind, he would never think about this matter. Sometimes, he would even subconsciously forget what was so special about his blood. In the morning after that night, the soul that had seeped out of his body and entered his blood, no longer emitting a sliver. However, that loathing and fear still remained in the depths of his sea of consciousness. After coming to the capital, he believed that he had already distanced himself from those terrifying memories. He could feel that the smell of his blood seemed to be fading. Yet on that morning, after viewing all the monoliths of the front mausoleum and one night in the mausoleum of books, when he guided Starlight for purification for the first time, he shockingly discovered that everything seemed to have returned to that night when he was 10 years old. He did not want to experience that night again, did not want to sense the unknown spying from the clouds. Thus, he became even more cautious. When he was heavily injured in battle and wanted to vomit blood, even if he had to brave the danger, he would swallow it back at the first moment. No matter how powerful his opponent was, he no longer dared to completely burn the lake water outside his ethereal palace, because he was afraid that it would be like that time in the underground space, where he would be blasted into a bloody mess by true essence. He could not bleed. He could not let others smell his blood. This was something he did not need to think about, but it was a matter of the highest importance. It was even more important than his life, because he had always remembered his senior's warning. But today, in this mausoleum, he did not listen to his senior's warning, because he wanted to save someone. He looked at the sleeping Su Yurong and revealed a satisfied smile. Because she was poisoned, her face had always been somewhat swollen. At this moment, the swollen had clearly decreased by a lot, and her elegant eyes became even clearer. Most importantly, her face, which was as pale as snow, gradually regained some color. In a place very far from Zhou Dufu's mausoleum, there was an old temple. If one counted the first sacrificial temple from 1,000 li away, then this old temple should be the ninth. This also meant that the distance to Zhou Dufu's mausoleum was only 200 li. This was something that even a child who had just started learning could calculate clearly, so Nank and the others naturally would not make a mistake. The zither-playing old man sighed with emotion. I never thought that there would be a day in my life where I could see the mausoleum of Zhou with my own eyes. Tung Xiaoming carried a pole and gazed at the black protrusion that could faintly be seen in the distant sky. He, who had always been silent and dull, had an excited expression at this moment. As for his wife, Lu Wan, and the two demon beauties, they were even more so. After several dozen days of bitter walking, even these demon experts felt that it was somewhat exhausting. However, when they thought about how Su Yurong and Chun Changsheng were just ahead waiting to die, and more importantly, that the end of the white grass path might very well be the legendary mausoleum of Zhou, what did this kind of hardship count for? Suddenly, the white grass path began to tremble slightly. The source of the trembling came from the depths of the vast plain behind them. The zither-playing old man was slightly astonished. He turned around and looked towards the plain and said with a serious expression, "The monsters seem to be somewhat restless." Suddenly, his expression changed drastically. He opened his mouth, but was so shocked that he could not speak. The demon general couple also saw the strange phenomenon in the sky. The chi on their bodies suddenly rose to the limit that the garden of Zhou could contain. A shadow appeared in the sky above the plain. The shadow was so large that it seemed to cover half the sky. This shadow was currently moving slowly. From a distance, it seemed like a pair of incomparably huge wings. Nank looked at the shadow in the sky and furrowed her brows. Even the heavenly Peng is somewhat crazy. Just what has happened? She did not know that the source of the restlessness of the monsters in the plain came from the depths of the mausoleum 200 li away. In the depths of the mausoleum, a youth had cut open his own wrist, and fresh blood was exposed to the air. The smell of blood diffused through the plain. It was already extremely faint, but it was still enough to make the monsters of this world feel an incomparably crazy desire. Around the mausoleum, there were extremely ingeniously designed ventilation channels and light channels. There was no need to worry about rain pouring in through those channels, but it allowed fresh wind and light to enter. It was also unknown what Zhou Dufu was thinking when he ordered the design of his own mausoleum. Could it be that after death, people still needed to breathe fresh wind and enjoy the bright and beautiful spring scenery? Chun Changsheng could not understand, but through the change in the light and the humidity in the air, he confirmed that it should be the morning of the next day. Moreover, the rain outside the mausoleum should have stopped. Just at this moment, Su Yurong finally woke up. Chun Changsheng looked at her and smiled. She did not smile. She stared blankly at him and asked, "You poured your own blood in my body?" Chun Changsheng said, "To be more accurate, I poured my own blood into your arteries." Su Yurong was somewhat helpless, somewhat sad, and somewhat tired. She said, "Although I don't know what method you used to do all this, do you think this will work?" "I've said it before, my blood. Yes, this will work." Without waiting for her to finish, Chun Changsheng said with a smile. His face was somewhat pale, and his expression was somewhat weary. However, his eyes were very bright, very clean, and very confident, like the rising sun. Although it was covered by the clouds, its brilliance did not diminish. Seeing his expression, Su Yurong had a thought that even she did not believe. She muttered, "This will also work. It seems to work." Chun Changsheng walked to her side and observed the wound on her neck. Then he said, "Feel it yourself." Su Yurong was somewhat at a loss. She subconsciously observed herself according to his words, and discovered that her blood was actually not as dried up as it was before she fainted. Although it was not as abundant as usual, and was still rather thin, it could at least guarantee that she was alive. How important it was to be alive, how good it was, the most important, the best. However, why was she able to survive? Just what was going on? At this moment, the blood flowing through her body should clearly be his blood, but why was it like her own blood, without any difference? At least right now, it can be confirmed that Chun Changsheng's blood type is O. Tomorrow is Monday. My dear fellow, don't forget to vote for me. Thank you.